I'm too young to be a wife. Those 7 words would ignite a firestorm across the Montana Territory and force one man to choose between the law and his conscience. When a 13-year-old girl arrived at Ethan Hale's ranch, fleeing a forced marriage to a violent man twice her age, he faced an impossible decision: turn her away to certain suffering, or hide her and become an outlaw himself. What happened next would divide a community, challenge every notion of justice, and prove that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is say one simple word: no. If you want to see how far one man will go to protect an innocent life, stay until the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The Montana sky bled crimson as the sun descended behind the Bitterroot Range, casting long shadows across Ethan Hale's property like dark fingers reaching toward something they could never quite grasp. He stood on his porch, one hand resting on the weathered post he'd carved himself 15 years earlier, back when hope still lived in this house. Back when laughter echoed through these rooms. Now, there was only silence. Ethan was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape he worked. Tall, lean, with hands that bore the permanent stains of labor and eyes that had seen too much loss. His hair, once dark as creek stones, now carried streaks of gray at the temples, and deep lines framed his mouth, testimony to years of worry worn like a second skin. He was 43, though some days he felt twice that. The ranch sprawled across 200 acres of stubborn land that fought him for every bushel of wheat, every head of cattle. It wasn't much by territorial standards, but it was his. More importantly, it was far enough from town that a man could think his own thoughts, without neighbors peering through the windows of his life. He just finished the evening feeding when he saw it. A single covered wagon emerging from the cottonwood grove that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Unusual. The main road lay 3 miles south. Nobody came this way unless they were lost or didn't want to be seen. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped beside his door, though he didn't pick it up. Not yet. He watched as the wagon drew closer, pulled by a tired-looking mare that had seen better days. The driver sat hunched forward, and even from a distance, Ethan could see the tension in their shoulders. When the wagon finally creaked to a halt 20 yards from his porch, Ethan got his first clear look at the driver. A woman, perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of anxiety. Her dress was plain but well-made, the kind worn by townsfolk with some means. Her eyes, when they met his, carried a desperation that made his stomach tighten. "Help you?" Ethan called out, not moving from the porch. Hospitality was one thing, foolishness was another. The woman's hands trembled as she wrapped the reins around the brake handle. "Mr. Hale? Ethan Hale?" "Depends on who's asking." "My name is Margaret Brennan." Her voice cracked slightly. I need to speak with you. It's urgent. It's about—" She glanced back at the covered wagon bed, then returned her gaze to him. "Please. I heard you were a decent man. I'm praying that's true." Ethan studied her for a long moment. There was no guile in her face, only fear and something that looked like shame. He descended the porch steps slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I try to be," he said quietly. "What brings you out here at dusk, Mrs. Brennan?" "It's Miss Brennan," she corrected automatically, then shook her head as if the detail didn't matter. "I've come from Millerville, 3 days' travel. I have my niece with me." As if on cue, the canvas covering the wagon bed stirred. Ethan watched as a small hand appeared, pushing the fabric aside. Then a face, young, impossibly young, peered out into the dying light. The girl couldn't have been more than 13, 14 at most. She had dark hair that hung in tangled waves around a face that still carried the softness of childhood, though her eyes held something far older. They were the kind of eyes Ethan had seen on soldiers returning from war, eyes that had witnessed things they could never unsee. "This is Mara," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother's daughter." Mara climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to make herself small, unobtrusive. She wore a simple cotton dress that had been mended in several places, and her feet were covered by boots 2 sizes too large. She stood beside the wagon, one hand resting on the wheel, and said nothing. Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He'd seen enough of the world to know when something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. "Why don't you both come inside?" he said, gesturing toward the house. "I've got coffee on. You can tell me what this is about." Margaret shook her head violently. "There's no time for coffee, Mr. Hale. We can't be seen here. If anyone finds out I brought her—" She closed her eyes, steadying herself. "I need you to understand something. My brother, Mara's father, he's made a bargain, a terrible bargain." "What kind of bargain?" The woman's face crumpled. "He owed money, a lot of money, to Silas Crow." Ethan felt his jaw tighten at the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew Silas Crow. The man owned half of Millerville, including the bank, the largest general store, and substantial grazing land. He'd made his fortune through shrewd business deals that often left the other party somehow diminished, though no one could ever quite prove he'd broken any laws. Crow was in his late 50s, a widower with a reputation for getting what he wanted, one way or another. "Your brother borrowed from Crow?" Ethan asked, though he already suspected the answer would be worse. "Gambled," Margaret said bitterly. "Thomas always had a problem with cards, but this time he got in deep with Crow's gaming house. $5,000 deep." Ethan whistled low. That was more money than most men saw in a lifetime. "When Thomas couldn't pay," Margaret continued, her voice shaking, "Crow offered him a way to settle the debt." She looked at her niece, and tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks. "He offered to take Mara instead, as his wife." The words hung in the air like a curse. Ethan felt rage ignite in his chest, hot and immediate. "He what?" "The wedding is scheduled for 4 days from now," Margaret said quickly. "Thomas agreed. He actually agreed, said it was a good match, that Crow could provide for her better than he ever could. But that's not why he did it. He did it to save his own skin, to clear his debts, and walk away free." Ethan looked at the girl, Mara, who still hadn't spoken. She met his gaze steadily, and in her eyes he saw no tears, only a fierce, burning determination. "What does Mara say about this?" he asked quietly. The girl's voice, when it finally came, was clear and unwavering despite her youth. "I said, I'm too young to be a wife." 5 words. Simple. Undeniable. True. "But my father says I don't have a choice," Mara continued, her small hands balling into fists at her sides. "He says a deal is a deal, that I need to honor his word since he's my father. But Mr. Crow is—" She faltered for just a moment, and Ethan saw genuine fear flash across her features. "He's mean. I've seen how he treats people, how he looks at me. And I'm only 13 years old." 13, Ethan repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Margaret stepped forward, her desperation palpable. "I couldn't let it happen. I'm Thomas's sister, but I can't stand by and watch him sell his own daughter like livestock. I tried everything. I offered what little money I had saved. I begged him to find another way. I even went to the marshal. But Thomas has every legal right as her father, and Crow has the law on his side. The contract is binding. Everything is arranged." "So you brought her here," Ethan said slowly, understanding dawning. "To me. Why?" "Because I heard about you," Margaret said, "about what happened to your family, about how you understand what it means to lose a child." Ethan flinched as if he'd been struck. His hand instinctively moved to his chest, to the place where grief lived like a stone lodged beneath his ribs. 7 years ago, his daughter Emma had died of scarlet fever. She'd been 12, just a year younger than Mara stood before him now. His wife Sarah had followed 6 months later, though the doctor called it pneumonia. Ethan knew better. Sarah had died of a broken heart, of a world that no longer held their child's laughter. "That's a cruel card to play," he said quietly. "I know," Margaret whispered. "But I'm out of options. Crow has men looking for us. When he finds out I've taken Mara, he'll come for her. He'll bring the law if he has to, because that contract is legal. I can't protect her. I'm just a spinster schoolteacher with no property and no standing. But you have land. You're respected. You're far enough from Millerville that maybe, just maybe—" "You want me to hide her," Ethan finished. "I want you to save her." The silence that followed was broken only by the evening wind whistling through the eaves of the barn and the nervous stamping of the wagon horse. Ethan looked from Margaret to Mara, the slip of a girl who'd been bartered away like a sack of grain. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to refuse. He'd be harboring what amounted to stolen property in the eyes of the law. Silas Crow was a powerful man with powerful friends. The marshal, the judge, half the businessmen in the territory, they all owed Crow favors or feared his retribution. Going against him would bring trouble down on Ethan like a rock slide. But then he looked at Mara's face again, and he saw Emma. Not a physical resemblance. Emma had been blonde and fair where Mara was dark. But something in her eyes, that same fierce spirit, that same bright intelligence that should have had decades ahead of it to grow and flourish. He thought about the life that awaited this child if he turned her away. Married to a man 4 times her age, a man known for his cruelty and his appetites. She'd be trapped, used, broken before she ever had a chance to become who she was meant to be. And in 10 years, 20, she might look back at this moment and wonder why no one had the courage to help her when she needed it most. Ethan had failed to save his own daughter. Emma's death had been beyond his control, an illness that swept through the territory, taking children seemingly at random. He'd held her hand as she died, whispering promises he couldn't keep about how everything would be fine. But this he could control. This choice was his to make. How long would she need to stay? He asked, and he saw hope flare in Margaret's eyes. I don't know, the woman admitted. I have a cousin in California. If I can get word to her, she might take Mara in. But it would take time to arrange, and even then, she trailed off, the impossibility of the situation evident in her expression. People will come looking, Ethan said. You understand that. They'll search every farm, every ranch within 100 miles. I know. And if they find her here, I'll be arrested, possibly worse. I know, Margaret repeated, her voice breaking. I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. But you're a good man, Mr. Hale. Everyone says so. And good men are rare enough that when you find one, sometimes you have to ask them to do the impossible. Ethan turned his gaze to Mara. What do you want, girl? Your own words. Mara straightened, her chin lifting in defiance that seemed too large for her small frame. I want to be free. I want to go to school. I want to grow up before I have to be anybody's wife. And I definitely don't want to be Silas Crow's anything. She paused, then added with quiet intensity, I'll work for my keep. Strong. I can cook and clean and help with the animals. I won't be a burden. That's not what I asked. I want you to hide me, Mara said clearly. I'm asking you to help me, please. Ethan closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw his daughter's grave, marked by a simple white cross on the hill behind the house. He saw Sarah's empty chair by the fireplace. He saw all the moments of happiness that had been stolen by forces beyond his control. But this moment, this choice, he could control. When he opened his eyes, his decision was made. Bring her inside, he said quietly. We'll figure out the rest as we go. The relief that flooded Margaret's face was almost painful to witness. She sagged against the wagon, one hand pressed to her chest as if to keep her heart from bursting. Thank you, thank you. You don't know what this means. I do know, Ethan interrupted gently. That's why I'm doing it. He looked at Mara. Come on, then. Let's get you settled before it's full dark. As Mara climbed down from the wagon, Margaret reached out and gripped Ethan's arm with surprising strength. I need to leave before anyone notices I'm gone. I'll tell Thomas she ran away, that I couldn't stop her. It might buy us some time. Won't he suspect you brought her somewhere? Probably, but he can't prove it. And Silas, Margaret's face hardened. Silas will be furious enough that Thomas might not survive the conversation anyway. Ethan escorted Mara into the house, acutely aware of how small she seemed in the doorway. The interior was sparse, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, 2 bedrooms, and a loft where he stored supplies. Everything was clean but worn, the possessions of a man who'd stopped caring about comfort years ago. You'll sleep in the spare room, he said, gesturing to the smaller bedroom off the main area. It had been Emma's room once, though he'd stripped it bare after Sarah's death, unable to bear the reminders. Now it held only a narrow bed and a plain wooden dresser. Mara set down the small bundle of belongings she'd carried from the wagon, Apparently all she owned in the world fit into a single cloth sack. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," she said quietly. "Ethan, if you're staying here, you call me Ethan." "Thank you, Ethan." He showed her where the wash basin was, where he kept the food stores, how to work the pump for the well. Simple things, domestic things, yet each instruction felt weighted with significance. He was crossing a line he could never uncross. When Margaret finally departed, driving her wagon back into the gathering darkness, Ethan and Mara stood on the porch and watched until she disappeared into the cottonwoods. The girl beside him was silent, but he could feel her trembling slightly. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Yes," she admitted. "But I'm more afraid of what happens if I go back." "Fair enough." He paused, then added, "I can't promise this will work out. I can't promise they won't find you. But I can promise that while you're under my roof, no one will take you anywhere you don't want to go. You understand?" Mara looked up at him, and for the first time he saw her eyes glisten with unshed tears. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I had a daughter once," he said finally. "She'd be about 19 now if she'd lived. And I like to think that if she'd ever needed help, someone would have had the decency to give it to her. I'm sorry you lost her." "Me too." He cleared his throat, pushing away the grief that always lurked at the edges of his thoughts. "Come on. It's getting cold. Let's go inside." That first night, Ethan lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering what in the name of all that was holy he'd just agreed to. He could hear Mara moving around in the next room, the creak of the bed frame as she settled in, and he found himself listening to those sounds with an alertness he hadn't felt in years. He'd committed himself to protecting this child. But how? Silas Crow wouldn't give up easily. The man's pride alone would demand satisfaction, setting aside whatever darker purposes he had for wanting a 13-year-old bride. And Crow had resources, money, influence, hired men who asked few questions. Ethan would need help. But who could he trust with something like this? Most of his neighbors were decent folk, but decent didn't always mean brave, especially when going against someone as powerful as Crow. He thought of his closest neighbor, a rancher named Dutch Harrison, who lived 5 miles west. Dutch was a good man, a veteran of the war back east who'd come west to escape the memories. He had a strong moral compass and little patience for injustice. But he also had a wife and 3 children to think about. Asking Dutch to take a stand could put his entire family at risk. Then there was Reverend Samuel Porter, who ran the small church in town. Samuel was vocal about righteousness and justice from his pulpit, but Ethan had noticed he grew considerably quieter when Silas Crow was in the congregation. Talk was easy. Action was another matter entirely. The truth was, Ethan might be alone in this. And if that was the case, he'd need to be smart. He'd need to think several moves ahead, like a chess player anticipating his opponent's strategy. Tomorrow he'd need to make preparations. The house had a root cellar that could serve as a hiding place if searchers came. He'd need to lay in extra supplies without arousing suspicion at the general store. He'd need to establish routines that could explain any unusual activity someone might notice. But most importantly, he'd need to teach Mara how to disappear, how to move silently, how to hide quickly, how to survive if the worst came to pass and she had to run. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Ethan woke to find Mara already up, dressed in the same worn dress from the previous night. She'd somehow managed to start the fire in the stove and had coffee brewing, weak coffee, since she'd clearly never made it before, but coffee nonetheless. "You didn't have to do that," he said, though he was touched by the gesture. "I told you I'd work for my keep," Mara replied. She hesitated, then added, "I can't cook much. Aunt Margaret tried to teach me, but my father always said domestic skills were wasted on me since I was too plain to catch a husband anyway." Ethan felt anger flare at the casual cruelty of that statement. "Your father's a fool." "Yes," Mara agreed simply. "But he's still my father, and the law says he owns me until I'm of age or married off. The law isn't always right." "No, but it's still the law." They ate a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and bacon, the silence between them not quite comfortable but not hostile either. Ethan found himself studying the girl across the table, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the careful way she observed everything around her as if cataloging details for future reference. "Can you read?" he asked. Mara's face brightened considerably. "Yes. Aunt Margaret taught me. She says I'm quite good at it, actually. I can write too, and do figures." "That's good. That's very good." An idea was forming in Ethan's mind. "Tell me, Mara, what do you want to do with your life? Assuming we can keep you safe, assuming you have a choice, what would you choose?" She didn't hesitate. "I want to be a teacher, like Aunt Margaret. I want to help other children learn, especially girls. So many girls around Millerville can't read or write because their families say it's not important. But it is important. Knowledge makes you free." "Smart girl." "That's what scares my father, I think," Mara said quietly. "I ask too many questions. I read too much. He says I've gotten ideas above my station." She paused, her expression hardening. "When Mr. Crow first came to our house to discuss the arrangement, I asked him directly what he wanted with a wife young enough to be his granddaughter. He didn't like that. I imagine he didn't. My father struck me for the impertinence, said I needed to learn my place, but Mr. Crow just smiled. It was worse than anger. He said he appreciated spirit in his possessions, as long as they learned proper obedience in time." Mara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's when I knew I had to run, because he doesn't want a wife. He wants something he can break." Ethan's hands clenched around his coffee cup, hard enough that he worried the ceramic might crack. "That won't happen. I won't let it happen." "You can't promise that." "Maybe not, but I can promise I'll die trying." The certainty in his voice seemed to reassure her, and some of the tension left her shoulders. They finished breakfast in silence, and then Ethan took her outside to begin the practical work of hiding in plain sight. He showed her the barn first, pointing out the loose board in the back wall that led to a narrow space between the inner and outer walls, tight enough to be uncomfortable but large enough to conceal a small person if necessary. Then the root cellar beneath the house, accessed through a trap door in the kitchen floor that was usually covered by a heavy rug. Finally, the most important hiding spot of all, the storm shelter he dug into the hillside 50 yards from the house. "If riders come and you can't get to the cellar, you run for this shelter," he instructed. "It's disguised with brush, but once you know where it is, you can find it in the dark. Inside there's water, dried food, blankets. You could survive there for several days if you had to." Mara examined each location with careful attention, asking practical questions about approach angles and visibility. It struck Ethan that she was taking this seriously in a way that suggested she'd already accepted the danger as real and imminent. "Have you thought about what you'll do if they come?" she asked as they walked back toward the house. "Some. I figure the first searchers will be deputies or hired men. If I act natural, claim ignorance, they might move on. Crow won't want to show his hand too early. He'll try the legal routes first. And when the legal routes don't work, then things get more difficult." They were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats on the main road. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as he turned to see a rider approaching, but his tension eased slightly when he recognized Dutch Harrison's rangy form in the saddle. "Get in the house," Ethan said quietly to Mara. "Stay away from the windows." She obeyed without question, slipping inside while Ethan walked out to meet his neighbor. Dutch was a tall man with a scarred face and the bearing of someone who'd seen combat. He dismounted with the easy grace of a lifelong horseman. "Morning, Ethan," Dutch called out. "Got a minute?" "Always got time for you, Dutch. Coffee?" "Wouldn't say no." They walked toward the house together, and Ethan felt his mind racing. Had Dutch heard something? Was this a social call or something more? He maintained a carefully neutral expression as they entered the main room. Mara had vanished, presumably into her bedroom. Ethan poured coffee and gestured for Dutch to sit at the table. "What brings you out this way?" Ethan asked casually. Dutch took a long sip before answering. "Actually, I came to ask if you'd heard the news from Millerville." Ethan felt ice creep down his spine. "What news?" "Silas Crow's looking for a girl. His intended bride, apparently. Young thing, 13 or 14. Daughter of some gambler who owed Crow money. Story is the girl ran away just days before the wedding." Dutch's eyes were sharp as he watched Ethan's face. "Crow's offering a substantial reward for information leading to her return. $500. $500. That was enough to buy a man's conscience in these parts, or at least his silence. Terrible thing, Ethan said carefully, a child running away from home like that. Is it? Dutch asked quietly. Seems to me a child running away from a forced marriage to a man 4 times her age might be showing some sense. The two men locked eyes across the table. Ethan made a decision in that moment. Dutch had come here for a reason, and it wasn't to collect a reward. I heard Crow's got a mean streak, Ethan said slowly. Not the kind of man I'd want anyone marrying, let alone a girl barely old enough to understand what marriage means. That's my thinking too, Dutch agreed. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. I also heard that Margaret Brennan left Millerville 3 days ago. Schoolteacher, sister to the girl's father. No one knows where she went. That's so? That's so. Dutch leaned back in his chair. Ethan, we've been neighbors for 5 years now. In that time, you've never given me cause to doubt your character. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. Ask. If a man, a good man, knew where that girl was hiding, and if he was protecting her from a situation that any decent person would recognize as wrong, would he be breaking the law or following a higher authority? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I'd say that depends on whose law you're talking about. Man's law isn't always the same as what's right. Dutch nodded slowly. That's what I thought you'd say. He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. I should get back. My wife will wonder where I've gotten to. He was at the door when Ethan called out, Dutch? Yeah? If that man you mentioned, the one protecting the girl, if he found himself in trouble, do you think he'd have any friends willing to stand with him? Dutch turned, his scarred face splitting into a grim smile. I'd say he'd have at least one, maybe more, if word got around to the right people. He paused. But he should know that Crow's not going to give up easily. And the law being what it is, standing up for what's right might cost a man everything. Some things are worth the cost. Yeah, Dutch agreed. Some things are. He tipped his hat. You take care now, Ethan. Keep your eyes open. Wolves are circling. After Dutch left, Mara emerged from her hiding place. He knows I'm here, she said. It wasn't a question. He suspects, but he won't say anything. He might even help if it comes to that. Why would he risk it? He has a family. Ethan met her gaze steadily. Because he's a man who knows the difference between legal and right. And because sometimes that difference matters more than safety. Over the next 2 days, Ethan settled into an uneasy routine. He went about his normal work, feeding the animals, mending fences, preparing for the coming winter, while remaining constantly alert for signs of approaching riders. Mara stayed close to the house, helping where she could and diving for hiding places at the slightest sound. She was a quick learner and remarkably resilient for someone so young. She didn't complain about the sparse accommodations or the constant fear. Instead, she made herself useful, cooking meals with increasing skill, helping to organize Ethan's disorganized supplies, even reading aloud in the evenings from the few books he owned. It was during one of these evening reading sessions that Ethan realized how much life had returned to his house. For the first time in 7 years, there was a voice other than his own echoing through the rooms. There was purpose beyond simple survival. There was something worth protecting. He thought often of Emma during those days. If she had lived, would she have had Mara's courage? Would she have stood up for herself the way this girl was willing to stand? He liked to think so. Sarah had been strong-willed, and Emma had inherited that iron spine along with her mother's kindness. On the 3rd day, riders came. Ethan spotted them from a distance. 3 men on horseback, moving methodically from farm to farm along the valley. He recognized the technique. Systematic searching, covering every property, leaving no stone unturned. Mara, he called calmly, though his heart hammered in his chest. Time to practice what we discussed. She appeared from the kitchen, took one look at his face, and moved immediately toward the root cellar. She'd lifted the trap door and was descending the ladder when Ethan stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. Whatever you hear, he said quietly. Whatever they say, you stay silent and still. Understand? Even if it sounds like they're hurting me, you don't make a sound, because the moment they know you're here, everything becomes harder. I understand, Mara whispered. Then with a child's simple faith that broke Ethan's heart, she added, I trust you. The trapdoor closed. Ethan replaced the heavy rug and straightened the furniture, making sure everything looked normal. Then he went outside to meet his visitors, his rifle held loosely in one hand. Not threatening, just the natural caution of a rancher in isolated territory. The three riders drew up in front of his porch. The leader was a man Ethan didn't recognize, hard-faced, wearing a deputy's badge that looked like it had been pinned on recently. The other two were clearly hired muscle, the kind of men who made their living through intimidation and violence. "Afternoon," Ethan called out in a neutral tone. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The deputy dismounted, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Afternoon. I'm Deputy Collins from Millerville. We're looking for a missing girl. 13 years old, dark hair, last seen 3 days ago. Goes by the name Mara Brennan." "Haven't seen any children out this way," Ethan said truthfully. "It's just me on this property. Mind if we look around?" It wasn't really a question. Ethan gestured toward the barn. "Help yourselves. You'll find it's mostly empty. Been a slow year." The two hired men dismounted and began searching while Deputy Collins stayed with Ethan, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You live alone out here?" Collins asked. "I do now. Lost my family some years back." "That's rough." The deputy's voice held no real sympathy. "Must get lonely." "I manage." "See, the thing is," Collins continued, walking slowly toward the house, "we've been to every farm and ranch in this valley. Most folks haven't seen anything unusual, but a few mentioned they'd noticed you had a visitor a couple nights back. Wagon that came in after dark, left before dawn." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "Can't speak to what my neighbors think they saw. I don't get many visitors." "But you did have one that night, didn't you?" "Had a traveling peddler stop by, sold me some supplies. He moved on." "Mail peddler?" "That's right." Collins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Funny, the neighbor who mentioned it thought the driver looked more like a woman. Older woman, maybe." "Might have been. Hard to say in the dark. Didn't pay much attention." They were interrupted by one of the hired men calling from the barn. "Nothing out here, deputy." Collins nodded, then turned back to Ethan. "Mind if we check inside the house?" Every instinct screamed at Ethan to refuse, to stand his ground and send them away. But that would only raise suspicion. He needed to appear cooperative, unsuspicious. "Be my guest," he said, gesturing toward the door. He followed them inside, his pulse pounding in his ears. The three men moved through the main room, opening cabinets and checking corners with practiced efficiency. One of the hired men started toward Mara's bedroom, and Ethan felt his hand tighten on his rifle. "Bedroom's empty," he said quickly. "Just storage." The man ignored him and pushed open the door anyway. Ethan held his breath, but the room appeared undisturbed. Mara had been careful to leave no trace of her presence. The bed was made with military precision, the dresser empty. They moved to his own bedroom next, then began examining the kitchen. One of the men's boot heels struck the floor directly over the root cellar with a heavy thud, and Ethan's heart nearly stopped. But the sound was no different from any other part of the floor, and the heavy rug concealed the trapdoor perfectly. After what felt like an eternity, Deputy Collins nodded to his companions. "Looks clean." They headed for the door, and Ethan allowed himself to breathe again. They'd made it. Mara was safe. But Collins paused on the threshold, turning back with that calculating look in his eyes. "One more thing, Mr. Hale. Mr. Crow wants it known that he's a generous man. That reward I mentioned, $500, that's for anyone who provides information. And he's made it clear he'll pay another $1,000 to the person who actually returns the girl to him." Collins let that sink in. "That's serious money. Life-changing money for a man working a hardscrabble ranch." "I'm sure it is," Ethan said evenly. "So if you were to remember anything about that wagon, or if you happen to hear anything about the girl's whereabouts, you'd be doing yourself a favor by sharing that information." "If I hear anything, I'll be sure to let someone know." Collins studied him for another long moment, then tipped his hat. "You do that." He paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "And Mr. Hale? Mr. Crow's a patient man, but his patience has limits. This girl is his legal property by contract. Anyone harboring her is guilty of theft and kidnapping. That carries a prison sentence, or worse." "I'll keep that in mind, Deputy." The three men mounted up and rode away, leaving Ethan standing on his porch with his rifle and his racing heart. He watched until they disappeared over the rise, then counted to 100 before going back inside. He moved the rug and opened the trapdoor. "They're gone. You can come up now." Mara emerged slowly, her face pale but composed. "They were standing right on top of me," she whispered. "I could hear every word." "I know. You did well. Stayed quiet like I told you." $1,500, she said quietly. "That's more money than most people see in their whole lives. Are you sure you want to do this? Because I'd understand if you changed your mind. That money could save your ranch. It could—" "Stop," Ethan interrupted gently. "That's blood money, and I won't touch it. You're not property. You're a person, and you deserve better than to be sold like cattle." Tears welled in her eyes, the first real tears he'd seen from her since she arrived. "I'm so scared," she admitted in a small voice. "And I'm so tired of being scared." Ethan did something then that surprised them both. He pulled her into an embrace, this child who wasn't his child, and held her while she cried. She felt impossibly small in his arms, fragile in a way that made his protective instincts roar to life. "I know you're scared," he said quietly, "but you're also brave. You stood up to your father, to Crow, to everyone who told you to accept something you knew was wrong. That takes courage most adults don't have. What if they come back? Then we'll deal with it, together." As he held Mara while she wept, Ethan realized with absolute clarity that he'd crossed a point of no return. Whatever came next, whether it was deputies with warrants, hired guns with worse intentions, or Silas Crow himself, he would stand between this child and harm. He'd failed to save Emma, failed to keep his own daughter safe from the random cruelty of disease. But Mara wasn't facing random chance. She was facing deliberate evil, the kind committed by men who should know better. And that kind of evil could be opposed, could be fought, could be defeated if someone had the courage to stand. As darkness fell over the Montana Territory that night, Ethan Hale began to understand what it truly meant to choose principle over safety. The path ahead would be dangerous. It would likely cost him dearly. But for the first time in 7 years, he felt truly alive. And he knew, with bone-deep certainty, that this was what he was meant to do. In the root cellar, he'd found not just a hiding place, but a purpose. And in protecting Mara, he'd found not just a cause worth fighting for, but perhaps a chance at redemption he'd never thought he'd see again. The wolves were circling, just as Dutch had warned. But Ethan was no sheep, and he'd be damned if he'd let them take this girl without a fight. The first battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The news spread through the valley like wildfire through dry grass, carried on whispers and knowing looks. By the end of the week, everyone within 20 miles knew that Silas Crow's intended bride had vanished, and that the man himself was furious enough to burn down half the territory to find her. Ethan heard the talk when he rode into town for supplies, keeping his expression carefully neutral as the shopkeeper's wife leaned across the counter with gleaming eyes, eager to share the latest gossip. "They're saying he's beside himself," Mrs. Patterson confided, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper despite the empty store. "Sent men to search every farm from here to the border. Some folks are saying the girl's probably dead by now, ran off into the wilderness and got herself killed by wolves or weather." "That's a grim thought," Ethan replied, loading flour and salt into his pack. "Others think someone's hiding her, that maybe she had help." Mrs. Patterson's eyes sharpened. "You haven't seen anything unusual out your way, have you, Mr. Hale? Any strangers passing through?" "Nothing worth mentioning." He counted out coins for his purchases, acutely aware of how the woman watched his every movement. "I keep to myself mostly." Of course. She accepted the money with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Though I imagine $1,500 would be mighty tempting for a man living alone on a struggling ranch. That's what Mr. Crow's offering now, you know, $1,500 for the girl's safe return." Ethan felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level. Money like that tends to bring out the worst in people. Or the best, depending on how you look at it. Mr. Crow just wants his property back, after all. He has every legal right. "Legal and right aren't always the same thing, Mrs. Patterson." The shopkeeper's wife drew back slightly, her expression cooling. "That's a dangerous philosophy in civilized society, Mr. Hale. We have laws for a reason." "We do," he agreed, shouldering his pack. "Question is whether those laws serve justice or just power." He left before she could respond, but he felt her eyes boring into his back as he mounted his horse. The encounter left him unsettled. If even Mrs. Patterson, normally a pleasant if gossipy woman, could look at him with suspicion, how long before someone decided to search his property more thoroughly? How long before gold fever overcame neighborly respect? When he returned to the ranch, he found Mara in the barn, mucking out stalls with fierce determination. She'd taken to the physical work with surprising enthusiasm, as if she could somehow earn her keep through sheer effort. Her face was flushed with exertion, and her 2 large boots were caked with mud. "You don't have to do that," Ethan said, though he was impressed by her thoroughness. "I want to help." She leaned on the pitchfork, catching her breath. "Besides, it gives me something to think about other than everything else." He understood that impulse. Work had been his salvation in the dark months after Sarah's death, when the silence of the house threatened to swallow him whole. "The town's buzzing with talk," he said, deciding she deserved to know the truth. "Crows increase the reward. People are watching for anything unusual." Mara's face paled, but she nodded with a composure beyond her years. "How long do you think we have?" "Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how desperate Crow gets and how much he's willing to spend to find you." "And my father?" Her voice was small. "Have you heard anything about him?" Ethan hesitated. The gossip had included whispers about Thomas Brennan, that Crow had been less than pleased to discover the girl missing, that there had been a confrontation at the gaming house, that Thomas had left Millerville with a broken nose and considerably fewer teeth than he'd started with. "Your father's alive," Ethan said carefully, "but I don't think he's in Crow's good graces anymore." "Good." The venom in that single word startled him. Mara's hands tightened on the pitchfork handle. "I know I'm supposed to honor my father, but I can't. Not after what he tried to do. Not after he looked me in the eye and told me I should be grateful Mr. Crow wanted me at all." "You don't owe him anything. Family's supposed to protect each other. Not—" He stopped, struggling to find words adequate to his disgust. "Not sell their children like livestock?" Mara finished bitterly. "That's exactly what he did. And the terrible thing is, he probably doesn't even think he did anything wrong. In his mind, he made a smart business deal." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders, moving fast. Ethan's hand went instinctively to his rifle as Mara dropped the pitchfork and ran for the house without being told. He watched her disappear through the door, then turned to face whoever was coming. To his surprise, it wasn't deputies or Crow's men. It was Dutch Harrison, accompanied by 3 other ranchers Ethan recognized. Samuel Cord, a grizzled cattleman who ran stock on the land north of Dutch's spread; Jacob Mueller, a German immigrant who'd homesteaded in the valley 5 years earlier; and Tom Ridley, a younger man who'd inherited his father's ranch and was still learning the business. Dutch dismounted first, his expression grim. "We need to talk, Ethan." "About what?" "About the fact that you've got Mara Brennan hidden somewhere on this property and what we're going to do about it." Ethan felt his world tilt. His hand tightened on the rifle, calculating distances and angles. 4 men against 1. Not odds he liked. But before he could speak, Dutch raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Easy, friend. We're not here to turn her in. We're here to help." "Help?" Ethan echoed, not daring to hope. Samuel Cord spat tobacco juice into the dirt and nodded. "That's right. We've all heard what Crow's trying to do, and we're not having it. Man wants to marry a girl barely old enough to understand what marriage means. That's not right, legal contract or not." Jacob Miller's accent thickened with emotion as he added, "In the old country, I see men with power do terrible things because no one stopped them. I come to America because here, we are supposed to be free. We are supposed to protect the weak, not sell them to highest bidder." Tom Ridley, the youngest of the group, looked uncomfortable but determined. "My sister's only 11. If someone tried to do to her what Crow's trying to do to that girl, I'd want someone to stand up for her. Seems only right to return the favor." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious," Dutch confirmed. "We've been talking amongst ourselves. There are maybe a dozen families in this valley who aren't sitting right with what's happening. We can't stop Crow outright. He's got too much money and influence for that. But we can make it harder for him to find the girl. We can watch each other's backs. And if it comes to a fight, The four men exchanged glances. Finally, Samuel spoke. Then it comes to a fight. I didn't serve 3 years in the war just to come home and watch powerful men abuse children without consequence. Relief and gratitude warred in Ethan's chest. He wasn't alone after all. But the feeling was quickly followed by concern. You all understand what you're risking? Crow's not going to take kindly to anyone interfering. He could make life difficult for you and your families. He could try, Dutch said with a hard smile. But there's a difference between one rancher standing alone and a dozen standing together. Crow's powerful, but he's not invincible. Ethan studied the faces of these men. His neighbors, some of them friends, all of them now allies in something that could destroy them. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. I appreciate this more than I can say, he said quietly. But I won't lie to you. The girl is here. And if anyone finds out you knew and didn't report it, you'll be considered accomplices. Let them consider away, Tom Ridley said, surprising everyone with the steel in his young voice. My pa used to say a man's got to stand for something or he'll fall for anything. I'm standing for this. Dutch clapped Ethan on the shoulder. We've set up a warning system. If anyone sees Crow's men or deputies heading this way, they'll ride ahead and give you notice. Should buy you enough time to get the girl hidden properly. There's more, Samuel added. We've been spreading some false trails. Mentioned to a few loose-lipped folks that we heard the girl might have caught a ride on a freight wagon heading east, or that someone saw a young woman matching her description boarding the stagecoach to Denver. Let Crow chase shadows for a while. Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. 7 years of isolation had taught him to expect nothing from others, to rely only on himself. But here were 4 men willing to put everything at risk for a child they'd never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. Thank you, he said, and the words felt inadequate. Don't thank us yet, Dutch replied. This is just the beginning. Crow's going to escalate. He has to, or he looks weak. And weak is one thing Silas Crow cannot afford to appear. The men stayed for another hour, discussing strategy and contingencies. They agreed on signal fires and meeting points, on ways to communicate without drawing attention, on what to do if the situation deteriorated further. By the time they rode away, Ethan felt simultaneously more secure and more vulnerable than before. He had allies now, but that also meant more people who could be hurt by his choices. Mara emerged from her hiding place in the root cellar after Ethan gave the all clear. Her eyes were red from crying, and he realized she'd heard everything. They're going to help us? She asked, her voice wavering between hope and disbelief. They are. Why? They don't even know me. Ethan thought about how to answer that. Because they're good men who understand that some things are more important than safety or profit. And because they have daughters and sisters and wives, and they know what it would mean if someone stood up for them. I don't deserve this, Mara whispered. Yes, you do. Every child deserves protection. Every person deserves the freedom to choose their own life. He paused, then added gently, You didn't do anything wrong, Mara. Your father's debts aren't your burden to carry. She nodded, but tears continued to stream down her face. Ethan let her cry, understanding that sometimes words weren't what a person needed. Sometimes they just needed to know someone else was there, bearing witness to their pain. That night, as Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about the path he'd chosen and the men who'd chosen to walk it with him. It reminded him of something his own father had once said, that the measure of a community wasn't in its prosperity, but in how it treated its most vulnerable members. By that measure, this valley was proving itself worthy. But he also knew Dutch was right. Crow would escalate. The man's pride demanded satisfaction, and every day the girl remained missing was another blow to his reputation. Someone as powerful as Silas Crow didn't become powerful by accepting defeat gracefully. The escalation came sooner than expected. 2 days later, Ethan was repairing a section of fence when he spotted a dust cloud on the horizon. Too large to be a single rider, too organized to be a cattle drive. His stomach dropped as he counted the approaching figures, at least a dozen men, moving with military precision toward his property. He ran for the house, calling for Mara as he burst through the door. Riders coming! A lot of them! She appeared instantly, her face pale but composed. They'd practiced this scenario so many times that her movements were automatic now. She grabbed the small bundle of supplies they kept ready, water, dried food, a blanket, and headed for the storm shelter. Wait, Ethan said, thinking quickly. Too many men. They'll search everywhere, including the shelter. We need to try something different. What do you mean? He made a split-second decision. Get changed into these. He pulled clothes from his chest, his smallest shirt, a pair of work pants he'd shrunk in the wash. And tie your hair up. Cover it with this hat. Understanding dawned in Mara's eyes. You want me to pretend to be a boy. It's risky, but if they're looking for a girl, they might overlook a ranch hand working in the barn. Can you do it? I can try. She changed quickly while Ethan kept watch out the window. The riders were getting closer, close enough now that he could make out individual figures. His blood ran cold when he recognized the man at the front. Silas Crow himself had come calling. Crow was a commanding figure even at 57, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty that lurked in his eyes. He wore expensive clothing that looked out of place on horseback, a dark suit with a gold watch chain, polished boots that had never seen real work. Behind him rode a mixture of deputies and hired guns, all armed, all looking ready for trouble. How do I look? Mara asked, and Ethan turned to find her transformed. With her hair hidden under the oversized hat and her frame disguised by baggy clothing, she could pass for a young boy if no one looked too closely. Smudge some dirt on your face, he instructed. And when they get here, keep your head down. Work on something that keeps you busy and away from direct sight. Can you pitch hay into the stalls? Yes. Then do that. Don't speak unless you absolutely have to, and if you do, keep your voice low. Understand? She nodded, and he saw fear in her eyes, but also determination. Whatever else Thomas Brennan had failed to teach his daughter, he'd somehow instilled in her a core of steel that wouldn't bend easily. You'll be fine, Ethan said with more confidence than he felt. Just remember, you're not Mara right now. You're Mark, my nephew visiting from back east. You've never heard of Silas Crow or any missing girl. You're just a boy doing chores. Mark, she repeated, trying the name out. Okay, I can be Mark. She slipped out the back door toward the barn while Ethan composed himself and walked out to meet his unwelcome visitors. The riders had formed a semicircle in front of his house, effectively boxing him in. Crow sat at the center on a magnificent bay horse, looking down at Ethan with an expression of cold assessment. Mr. Hale, Crow said, his voice smooth and cultured despite the menace beneath it, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Seems I don't have much choice in the matter, Ethan replied evenly. That's a lot of men for a social call, Mr. Crow. I prefer to be thorough. Crow dismounted with practiced ease and approached until he stood just outside of what most men would consider comfortable conversation distance, a deliberate invasion of personal space. I believe you know why I'm here. I can guess. You're looking for your runaway bride. She's not a runaway. She's stolen property. Ethan felt anger surge but kept it in check. Strange way to talk about a person. Is it? Crow's eyes narrowed. Her father signed a contract, legal and binding. The girl is mine by right of that contract until such time as she's delivered for our wedding. Anyone preventing that delivery is guilty of theft. Assuming someone's preventing it. Far as I know, the girl ran off on her own. Oh, I doubt that very much. Crow began walking slowly around Ethan, circling like a predator. A 13-year-old child alone in the wilderness? She'd never survive without help. Someone took her. Someone's hiding her. If they are, it's not me. Isn't it? Crow stopped directly in front of Ethan, close enough that Ethan could smell his expensive cologne. You see, I've made inquiries, asked around about who might have the foolish courage to interfere in my business. Your name came up several times. People talk, doesn't mean they know anything. They talk about how you lost your daughter years ago, how you've been alone ever since, nursing your grief like a wound you won't let heal. They talk about how a man like that might see a young girl in trouble and make unwise decisions out of misplaced sentiment. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. You're reaching. Am I? Crow gestured to his men. Search the property. Every building, every storage space, every potential hiding place. Be thorough. The men dismounted and spread out with professional efficiency. Ethan watched helplessly as they invaded his home, his barn, his privacy. 4 men entered the house while others headed toward the outbuildings. Through the barn door, he could see Mara, Mark, pitching hay into a stall with her back to the entrance. The picture of a bored teenage boy doing tedious work. Crow remained with Ethan, his presence a calculated intimidation. "I'm willing to be reasonable about this," he said conversationally. "The reward stands, $1,500 for information leading to her return. No questions asked about who might have been sheltering her. A man could do a lot with that kind of money." "I'm sure he could." "Your ranch is struggling, Mr. Hale. I can see it. The fences need repair, the barn roof is sagging. You're at least a season behind on proper maintenance. $1,500 would solve a lot of problems. Or create new ones." Crow's expression hardened. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." "The girl belongs to me. That's a legal fact. You can either help me recover my property and be compensated, or you can continue this stubborn resistance and face the consequences." "What consequences would those be?" "Obstruction of justice, theft, kidnapping. Those are serious crimes, Mr. Hale. Prison offenses, and that's assuming I pursue legal remedies." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. "I have other options if the law proves insufficient." Ethan met Crow's gaze without flinching. "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality. I'm a patient man, but my patience has limits, and when those limits are reached," Crow shrugged eloquently. "Well, accidents happen, ranches burn, men disappear. The frontier is a dangerous place." Before Ethan could respond, one of the searchers emerged from the barn. Ethan's heart nearly stopped when the man called out, "Mr. Crow, there's someone in the barn!" Crow's face lit with triumph. "Is that so? Bring them out." The searcher disappeared back inside and moments later emerged with Mara, still dressed as Mark, still keeping her head down. The man gripped her roughly by the arm and dragged her toward Crow. "Found this kid hiding in the back," the searcher reported. "Tried to act like he was just working, but something felt off." Ethan forced himself to remain calm even as panic clawed at his throat. Everything depended on Mara maintaining her composure now. Crow studied the figure before him with sharp eyes. "Look at me, boy." Mara kept her head down, her face obscured by the oversized hat. "I wasn't hiding. I was working like Mr. Hale told me to." "I said, look at me." Slowly, Mara raised her head, meeting Crow's gaze with an expression of confused defiance. Ethan held his breath, waiting for recognition to dawn in the man's eyes. But Crow frowned, uncertainty flickering across his features. The dirt smudged on Mara's face, the baggy clothing, the low pitch she'd affected in her voice. All of it combined to create an effective disguise. "Who are you?" Crow demanded. "Mark, sir. Mark Hale." She deepened her voice slightly, roughened it. "Ethan's my uncle. I'm visiting from back east, helping with the ranch work." "You're Hale's nephew?" Crow turned to Ethan, suspicion evident. Ethan nodded, hoping his face didn't betray the terror he felt. "My sister's boy. Sent him out here to learn some discipline. City life was making him soft." "How long has he been here?" "About a week." "Convenient timing," Crow observed. He looked back at Mara, his eyes narrowing. "Take off that hat, boy." This was the moment of truth. If Mara removed the hat and Crow saw her long hair, the game was over. Ethan tensed, preparing to fight even though he was vastly outnumbered. But Mara surprised them all. With a sullen teenage shrug, she pulled off the hat, revealing hair that had been roughly chopped short, barely 2 inches long all around her head. Ethan struggled to keep the shock off his face. When had she cut her hair? It must have been during the frantic minutes while she was changing clothes, a desperate gamble that might just save her life. Crow stared at the short-haired figure before him, clearly torn between suspicion and the evidence of his own eyes. The girl he was looking for had long, dark hair. Everyone knew that. This boy had short hair and an angular face smudged with dirt. "How old are you?" Crow asked. 15, sir." The lie came smoothly. "Be 16 in the spring." 15 was plausible. Mara was tall for 13, and with the baggy clothing disguising her frame, she could pass for an underfed teenage boy. Crow walked around her, examining her from every angle. Ethan could see him wanting to believe he'd found his missing bride, but unable to reconcile the evidence before him with what he expected to see. Finally, Crow stepped back. "This isn't her." Relief flooded through Ethan, though he was careful not to show it. But, Crow continued, turning to Ethan with cold fury, this boy arrived right around the time the girl disappeared. That's quite a coincidence. Sometimes coincidences are just coincidences, Ethan said, and sometimes they're cover stories. Crow gestured to two of his men. Hold the boy. I want to ask him some questions. The men grabbed Mara roughly, and Ethan started forward instinctively. There's no need for that. Stay where you are, Mr. Hale, unless you'd like my men to hold you as well. Crow approached Mara, looming over her. Now then, boy. I'm looking for a girl, 13 years old, dark hair, probably frightened. Have you seen anyone matching that description around here? No, sir, Mara said steadily. Just been working since I got here. Uncle Ethan keeps me busy. And you came from where exactly? Chicago, sir. My ma thought ranch work would straighten me out. Chicago. Crow's eyes glittered. Long way from home. Must have been a difficult journey for a boy your age. It wasn't so bad. Spent most of it reading. You can read? Yes, sir. Ma made sure of that at least. The interrogation continued for several more minutes, Crow probing for inconsistencies while Mara maintained her story with remarkable composure. Ethan watched, simultaneously terrified and proud. This child was braver than most grown men he'd known. Finally, Crow seemed to accept that this rough-looking ranch hand wasn't the delicate bride he was seeking. He released Mara with a disgusted gesture and turned back to Ethan. My men will finish searching the property. If I find any evidence that you're lying to me, Mr. Hale, you'll regret it for whatever short time remains of your life. The search continued for another hour. They turned the house inside out, checked every building, even examined the storm shelter. But they found nothing. No sign of a girl, no evidence of deception beyond a visiting nephew who might or might not actually exist. When they finally mounted up to leave, Crow paused beside Ethan. This isn't over. I'll find her eventually, and when I do, I'll remember everyone who impeded my search. I'm sure you will. Crow's face twisted with rage at Ethan's calm tone. For a moment it seemed he might order his men to attack right then, but instead, he spurred his horse violently and galloped away, his entourage following in a cloud of dust. Ethan and Mara stood frozen until the riders disappeared from view. Then Mara's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the porch steps, shaking uncontrollably. I thought he had me, she gasped. When he made me take off the hat, I thought... You did brilliantly, Ethan said, sitting beside her. When did you cut your hair? While I was changing, I grabbed your shears and just cut it all off. I figured if I was going to pretend to be a boy, I should look like one. She touched her roughly shorn head self-consciously. Is it awful? It probably saved your life. They sat together in the fading afternoon light, both processing how close they'd come to disaster. Finally, Mara spoke again, her voice small. He's not going to stop, is he? No, Ethan admitted. He's not. And the law's on his side. The law's on his side. So what do we do? Ethan thought about Dutch and the other ranchers, about the warning system they'd established, about the growing network of people who'd decided that some things mattered more than legal contracts. We keep fighting, he said finally. We keep you safe for as long as we can. And we hope that eventually someone with actual authority and actual conscience decides to do the right thing. That's not much of a plan. No, Ethan agreed, but it's the only one we've got. As darkness fell over the ranch that evening, Ethan lit the signal fire that would tell Dutch and the others that Crow had come and gone. Within an hour, he saw answering fires spring up across the valley. Silent messages of solidarity from neighbors he was only now learning to trust. Mara stood beside him, watching the fires bloom like stars against the dark landscape. They're all risking so much for me, she said quietly. People I've never even met. They're not just doing it for you, Ethan replied. They're doing it because if they let this happen, if they let a man like Crow buy and sell a child without consequence, then what does that say about them? About who they are? It says they're better than most people. Maybe. Or maybe it just says they're people who remember that laws are meant to serve justice, not replace it. That night, neither of them slept well. They both knew the next confrontation was coming, and next time Crow might not be satisfied with searching. Next time he might bring the full weight of the law down on Ethan's head. But for tonight, they were safe. For tonight, the valley stood with them, and tomorrow would have to take care of itself. The uneasy peace lasted exactly 6 days. Ethan woke before dawn on the 7th morning to find Dutch Harrison hammering on his door, his face grim in the pre-dawn darkness. Mara appeared from her room, still dressed in the boy's clothing she'd taken to wearing constantly now, her short hair sticking up at odd angles. "What's happened?" Ethan asked, pulling the door open. Dutch didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Marshal's coming. Left Millerville yesterday afternoon with a warrant for your arrest. He'll be here by mid-morning, maybe sooner if they rode through the night." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "On what charges?" "Kidnapping, harboring a fugitive, obstruction of justice." Dutch's expression was bleak. "Crow went to the territorial judge, convinced him you're hiding the girl. The judge issued the warrant based on circumstantial evidence in Crow's testimony. But they searched this place top to bottom. They found nothing." "Doesn't matter. Crow's painting a picture of you as a grieving father who's latched onto this girl as a replacement for his dead daughter. Says you're mentally unstable, dangerous. The judge bought it, or at least pretended to. Either way, the warrant's legal." Mara had gone pale, her hands gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles showed white. "If they arrest you, what happens to me?" "They'll keep searching until they find you," Dutch said bluntly. "And once they do, you'll be turned over to Crow. The law considers you his property until you reach majority or marry someone else." "I won't go back," Mara said, her voice shaking but determined. "I'd rather die out in the wilderness than marry that man." "It won't come to that," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He turned to Dutch. "How many men are coming with the marshal?" "4 deputies at least, maybe more, and Crow himself is riding with them. He wants to be there when you're arrested." "Of course he does." Ethan's mind raced through possibilities, each one bleaker than the last. If he resisted arrest, they'd charge him with assault on a lawman. If he surrendered, Mara would be left unprotected. And if he ran, he'd be a fugitive for the rest of his life. "There's more," Dutch continued. "Samuel Cord rode into Millerville yesterday, asking around. He heard Crow talking to the judge about making an example out of anyone who interfered with the recovery of his property. That means anyone caught helping you could face charges too." "Then you should go," Ethan said immediately. "All of you. Get as far from this as possible before you're caught up in it." Dutch's laugh was bitter. "Too late for that. We're already caught up in it. The question is what we do about it." "What can we do? The law's on Crow's side." "The law's on Crow's side because he bought it," Dutch corrected. "That doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean we have to roll over and accept it." But before Ethan could respond, they heard more horses approaching. His hand went to his rifle, but Dutch shook his head. "It's Samuel and the others. We called a meeting last night after I heard about the warrant. Figured we should talk through our options." Within minutes, Ethan's small house was crowded with nearly a dozen ranchers and their wives. Samuel Cord stood near the fireplace, his weathered face set in determined lines. Jacob Mueller had brought his wife Anna, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and iron-gray hair. Tom Ridley was there, along with his older brother James, who'd been away during the earlier confrontations. Even old Walter Chen, who ran a small farm on the eastern edge of the valley, had made the journey despite his 70 years. And there was one more person Ethan didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s, dressed in practical traveling clothes, with intelligent eyes that took in every detail of the room. Dutch made the introductions. "This is Catherine Morrison. She's a lawyer from Helena, and she's agreed to look into the legal aspects of this situation." Ethan blinked in surprise. "A lawyer? How did you—" "I sent a telegram 4 days ago," Dutch explained. "Figured we'd need legal help eventually. Miss Morrison rode all night to get here before the marshal arrives." Catherine Morrison stepped forward, extending her hand with a firm grip. "Mr. Hale, I've reviewed the documents your friends provided, the contract between Mr. Crow and Mr. Brennan, the arrest warrant, the relevant territorial statutes. It's an interesting case." "Interesting how?" "Interesting in that it highlights several fundamental questions about the limits of parental authority and the nature of consent in contracts involving minors." She pulled a folder from her bag and spread several papers on Ethan's kitchen table. "The contract itself is problematic from a legal standpoint. While it's true that parents have considerable authority over their children, there are limits to that authority, particularly when it comes to contracts that may not serve the child's best interests." "But is it legal?" Ethan pressed. Can a father really sell his daughter like this? Catherine's expression was troubled. Technically, he's not selling her. The contract is framed as a marriage agreement with the debt forgiveness as a separate consideration. It's cleverly worded to avoid the appearance of human trafficking. But morally? Ethically? This is precisely the kind of case that challenges the boundaries of our legal system. Which means what exactly? Samuel Cord asked. Which means the law is murky enough that a skilled advocate could argue either side. The question is whether we can find a judge willing to look past the technicalities and see this for what it really is, a child being coerced into marriage against her will. The judge in Millerville already made his position clear, Dutch pointed out. Yes, but there are other avenues, territorial courts, federal courts if necessary. The problem is that all of that takes time, and time is something we don't have. Catherine looked at Mara, who'd been standing silently in the corner. Which brings me to the most important question. Mara, do you understand what's at stake here? Mara stepped forward, her chin lifted in that defiant gesture Ethan had come to recognize. I understand that Mr. Crow thinks he owns me because my father sold me to him. I understand that the law says he's right. And I understand that if these people keep protecting me, they could all go to prison or worse. That's exactly right. So I need to ask you directly, do you consent to this marriage? If given the choice, completely free from coercion, would you agree to marry Silas Crow? Never. The word came out with absolute conviction. I'd rather spend my whole life in hiding than marry that man. I'm 13 years old. I'm too young to be anyone's wife, and even if I wasn't, I would never choose him. Catherine nodded, making notes. That's clear enough. The challenge is that under current law, your consent isn't strictly required until you reach the age of majority or are legally emancipated. Your father's consent is sufficient for the contract to be binding. That's insane, Anna Muller said, her accent thickening with emotion. A child should have say in her own life. I agree, Mrs. Muller, but what should be and what is are often very different things. Catherine turned back to the group. Here's what I propose. When the marshal arrives, Mr. Hale will surrender peacefully. We won't give them any excuse to add resisting arrest to the charges. Absolutely not, Ethan said immediately. If I'm arrested, there's no one to protect Mara. There are 11 of us here who can protect her, Dutch countered. But if you resist and they shoot you dead, you can't help her at all. Dutch is right, Catherine said. We need you alive and able to testify. While you're being processed, I'll file an emergency petition with the territorial court requesting a hearing on the validity of the marriage contract. I'll argue that the contract violates public policy and that Mara should be granted temporary emancipation pending a full review. Will that work? Tom Ridley asked. Honestly, I don't know, but it's the best shot we have at creating a legal pathway out of this mess. Catherine looked at each of them in turn. I won't lie to you, this is a long shot. The territorial courts tend to be conservative on questions of parental authority. But if we can get Mara in front of a judge, if we can make the judge see her as a person rather than as property, we might have a chance. And if we can't? Jakob Mueller asked quietly. Catherine's expression was grave. Then Mara will be turned over to Crow. Mr. Hale will likely spend several years in prison, and everyone who helped will face legal consequences of their own. The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled over them. Ethan looked at the faces around him. Neighbors who'd become allies, strangers who'd become friends, all of them willing to risk everything for a principle that couldn't be measured in dollars or defended by force of arms. I can't ask you to do this, he said quietly. Any of you. This is my choice, my consequence to face. You're not asking, Dutch replied. We're choosing. There's a difference. My husband and I, we come from Germany to escape tyranny, Anna Muller said, her voice trembling but firm. Here is supposed to be different. Here is supposed to be free. If we do nothing while child is sold like cattle, then what we escape from? We escape nothing. We bring the tyranny with us. Walter Chen spoke for the first time, his voice reedy with age but strong with conviction. In my country, we have saying, when good men do nothing, evil men win everything. I am old man, not many years left, but I will not spend those years knowing I stood by while wrong was done and I did nothing. One by one, each person in the room affirmed their commitment. Some spoke at length, others with just a few words. But the message was unanimous. They would stand together, whatever the cost. Ethan felt his eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. 7 years of isolation, of grief so deep it had carved him hollow, and now these people were teaching him what he'd forgotten. That standing alone was sometimes necessary, but standing together was always better. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt woefully inadequate. "All of you, thank you." Mara stepped forward then, her young face solemn. "I need to say something too. All of you are risking so much for me, and I'm grateful beyond words. But if this goes badly, if it looks like you're all going to be arrested or hurt because of me, I'll turn myself in. I won't let you suffer for my sake." "That's very noble," Catherine said gently, "but also very foolish. If you turn yourself in, everything these people have risked will be for nothing, and you'll be trapped in a marriage to a man who will almost certainly punish you for the trouble you've caused him. Better me than all of you." "No," Ethan said firmly. "Not better. You didn't choose any of this, Mara. Your father made a terrible decision and you're paying the price. But we're all choosing to stand with you because it's the right thing to do. Don't diminish that choice by trying to sacrifice yourself." Before Mara could respond, they heard the sound they'd been dreading, multiple horses approaching at a steady pace. Tom Ridley, who'd been watching from the window, turned with a pale face. "They're here. At least 6 riders, maybe more coming behind." The room erupted into controlled chaos. Catherine quickly gathered her papers while the ranchers moved to strategic positions, not to fight, but to bear witness. Anna Muller took Mara by the shoulders. "Listen to me, child. Whatever happens, you tell the truth. You say clearly that you do not want this marriage. You make sure everyone hears you. You understand?" Mara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand." Ethan moved to the door, his rifle conspicuously absent from his hands. He'd left it leaning against the wall inside, a deliberate choice to show he wasn't planning violence. Dutch stood beside him, solid and reassuring. "Whatever happens out there," Dutch said quietly, "remember that we're with you. You're not alone in this." "I know, that makes it worse somehow, knowing that my choices are affecting all of you." "Your choices?" Dutch shook his head. "Ethan, you didn't create this situation. Crow did. Mara's father did. You just decided not to look the other way, and there's nothing shameful in that." The riders drew up in front of the house, and Ethan got his first clear look at Marshal William Garrett. The marshal was a man in his late 50s, with iron gray hair and a face weathered by decades of frontier law enforcement. He wore his authority with the ease of long practice, but Ethan thought he detected something in the man's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even discomfort. Beside the marshal sat Silas Crow, resplendent in another expensive suit, his face alight with anticipation. 4 deputies flanked them, all armed, all watching Ethan's house with wary eyes. The marshal dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his pistol but not drawing it. "Ethan Hale? That's me. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of kidnapping and harboring a fugitive." The marshal pulled a folded document from his coat. "You want to read it? Or should I just tell you what it says?" "I can imagine what it says." Ethan descended the porch steps slowly, hands visible and empty. "I'm not going to resist, Marshal." Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he'd expected more of a fight. "That's smart of you. Makes things easier for everyone." "Before you arrest him," Catherine Morrison said, stepping out of the house, "I'd like to state for the record that I am Catherine Morrison, attorney at law, and I'm representing Mr. Hale in this matter. I have several objections to the validity of this warrant and the underlying charges." The marshal looked at her with something between surprise and respect. "You're a long way from Helena, Miss Morrison." "Justice doesn't recognize distance, Marshal Garrett, and this case raises serious questions about the application of territorial law." Crow spurred his horse forward, his face twisted with impatience. "This is ridiculous. The warrant is valid, the charges are clear, and this man is a criminal. Arrest him and let's be done with it." "Mr. Crow," the marshal said with surprising sharpness, "I'll thank you to let me do my job. I know you're anxious to resolve this situation, but I won't be rushed into improper procedure." Crow's jaw clenched, but he fell silent, seething. The marshal turned back to Ethan. "I'm going to need to search the premises again. The warrant authorizes it." "Search all you want," Ethan said. You won't find anything you didn't find last time. Maybe not. But Mr. Crow has sworn an affidavit stating that you're hiding Mara Brennan on this property. If he's right, I need to recover her. If he's wrong, that's something the court will sort out. And if the girl doesn't want to be recovered? Catherine asked. If she's here of her own free will, fleeing a forced marriage to a man 4 times her age? That's not how the law works, ma'am. Her father has legal authority over her until she's of age. If he's contracted her into marriage, that's his right. However distasteful some of us might find it. Some of us? Dutch Harrison stepped forward. You find this distasteful too, Marshal? Garrett's face showed a flash of something. Frustration, perhaps, or weariness. What I think personally doesn't matter. I enforce the law as it's written, not as I wish it was. Even when the law is wrong, Anna Muller called out. Even then, ma'am, because the alternative is chaos, where every man decides for himself which laws to follow and which to ignore. There's another alternative, Catherine said, courts that review laws and strike down those that violate fundamental principles of justice and human dignity. I filed a petition requesting exactly that, a hearing to determine whether this marriage contract is legally enforceable or whether it violates public policy. The marshal looked at her with grudging admiration. You work fast. When children's lives are at stake, I don't see the point in working slowly. Crow had heard enough. This is a delaying tactic, nothing more. The contract is valid, the warrant is valid, and I want my property returned to me immediately. She's not property, Ethan said, his voice hard. She's a 13-year-old girl. She's whatever the law says she is, Crow shot back. And the law says she's mine. Then the law's an ass, Dutch muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The marshal sighed heavily, looking like a man caught between conflicting duties. Let's just get this done. Deputies, search the house and outbuildings. Mr. Hale, I'm going to have to place you under arrest. Will you come peacefully? I will. Ethan extended his wrists for the handcuffs, but his eyes sought out the doorway where Mara stood watching, still dressed as a boy, her face streaked with tears. As the cold metal closed around his wrists, the deputies spread out to search. They were more thorough this time, pulling up floorboards, checking the attic space, examining every possible hiding spot. One deputy headed for the barn, while another made for the storm shelter. Ethan watched it all with a sinking feeling. They'd been lucky once with Mara's disguise, but if Crow looked closely enough, if he recognized something in her eyes or the shape of her face. The deputy searching the house emerged, shaking his head. Nothing inside, Marshal, just the usual living quarters. The barn search yielded the same result, as did the storm shelter. The deputies regrouped, reporting failure to find any sign of the missing girl. Crow's face had gone red with rage. She's here. I know she's here. That boy. He pointed at Mara. I saw him last time. There's something wrong about him. Search him. Check his identity. Mr. Crow, the marshal said wearily, we've searched the entire property. There's no sign of the girl. Because she's standing right there. Crow dismounted and stalked toward Mara. That's no boy. That's her. I can see it now. The eyes, the way she stands. She's cut her hair and dressed like a male, but it's her. Mara stood frozen as Crow approached, and Ethan saw terror flash across her face. But then something remarkable happened. Anna Mueller stepped between Crow and the girl, her sturdy frame blocking his path. You leave that child alone, Anna said firmly. You come to house of my friend. You make accusations. You arrest good man. This is enough. You do not touch child. That's not a child. It's my property. Crow tried to push past her, but now Jacob Mueller was there too, and Samuel Cord forming a human barrier between Crow and Mara. You want to get to her, Samuel said quietly. You'll have to go through us. The marshal's hand went to his pistol, but he didn't draw it. Folks, I appreciate your trying to help, but interfering with a lawful search is a crime. I don't want to arrest the whole lot of you. Then don't search the girl, Dutch countered. You've got no evidence she's who Crow claims. You've got a paranoid man making wild accusations. I'm not paranoid, Crow shouted. That is Mara Brennan, and I demand you verify her identity immediately. Catherine Morrison stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. Marshal Garrett, I'd like to point out that you have no legal authority to search a minor child's person without parental consent or probable cause. Mr. Crow's unsubstantiated claims do not constitute probable cause. That's debatable, the marshal said, though he sounded uncertain. Actually, it's not. Territorial statute is quite clear on this point. And if you do search this child without proper authority, and it turns out to be Mr. Hale's nephew as claimed, you'll be violating that child's rights and opening yourself to legal liability. The marshal looked thoroughly frustrated now, caught between competing legal obligations and growing pressure from all sides. He studied Mara for a long moment, taking in her short hair, her boy's clothing, the dirt on her face. "What's your name, son?" he asked finally. Mara's voice came out low and rough, just as she'd practiced. "Mark Hale, sir. I'm visiting my uncle from Chicago." "How old are you?" 15, sir, going on 16. "And you've been here how long?" "About 2 weeks now. Uncle Ethan's teaching me ranch work." 2 weeks. Crow seized on the detail. "That's exactly when Mara disappeared, don't you see? It's too perfect a coincidence." "Coincidences happen, Mr. Crow," the marshal said, though he still looked troubled. He turned back to Mara. "Do you have any documentation proving your identity? Travel papers, maybe? A letter from your mother?" This was the moment that could destroy everything. Mara had no such documentation because Mark Hale didn't exist. But before she could respond, Tom Ridley spoke up. "I've seen the boy around, Marshal. He helped me repair a fence line 3 days ago. Worked hard, didn't complain. Seemed like a regular kid to me." "I saw him too," James Ridley added, "at the general store in town. He was buying supplies for his uncle." They were lying, of course, creating a false history for a fictional person, but they did it so smoothly, so naturally, that even Ethan almost believed them. The marshal looked from face to face, seeing a wall of united testimony. His shoulders sagged slightly. "Mr. Crow, I don't have sufficient evidence to detain this boy on suspicion of being your missing bride. He appears to be exactly who he claims, a visiting nephew helping his uncle with ranch work." "You're making a mistake," Crow said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "That is Mara Brennan. I know it. And when the truth comes out, everyone who lied to protect her will face charges." "Maybe so," the marshal agreed. "But until I have proof, I have to go by what I can verify. And right now, all I can verify is that Ethan Hale is under arrest for kidnapping based on your sworn affidavit. Whether that charge holds up in court is another matter." He gestured to his deputies. "Load Mr. Hale onto a horse. We're heading back to Millerville." As the deputies moved to comply, Ethan caught Catherine Morrison's eye. She gave him a small nod, a silent message that she would do everything possible to fight this legally. Then he looked at Mara, who stood trembling but unbroken among her protectors. "Be strong," he said quietly, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "This isn't over." "I know," she whispered back. "Thank you for everything." They lifted Ethan onto a horse, his hands still cuffed in front of him. As the party prepared to depart, Crow turned to address the assembled ranchers. "You think you've won something here today," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "But this is far from over. That girl is mine by legal right, and I will have her, and every single person who's helped hide her will pay the price. I'll see to that personally." "Big words," Dutch Harrison said, "but threats are cheap. Proving them is another matter." Crow's eyes glittered with malice. "We'll see about that." The marshal's party rode away, taking Ethan with them. As the dust settled, the remaining ranchers gathered closer together, processing what had just happened. Mara collapsed onto the porch steps, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Anna Mueller sat beside her, wrapping the girl in her arms. "You did so well," Anna murmured. "So brave, so strong." "I was terrified," Mara admitted. "When Mr. Crow looked at me, I thought he knew. I thought it was all over." "But he didn't know for certain," Catherine said, crouching down to Mara's level. "And that uncertainty is what saved you. For now, at least." "What happens next?" Jacob Mueller asked. Catherine stood, her expression grave. "Now we fight this in court. I'll push for an emergency hearing on my petition. If I can get Mara in front of a judge, if I can make the case that this marriage contract is fundamentally unjust, we might be able to get it invalidated." "And if you can't?" Samuel Cord asked. Then Ethan goes to prison, Mara gets turned over to Crow, and everyone who testified today could face perjury charges. Catherine met each of their eyes in turn. I won't lie to you, the odds aren't good. Territorial courts are conservative, and Crow has money and influence, but we have something he doesn't. What's that? Tom Ridley asked. We have the truth. And sometimes, if you can get the truth in front of the right person, it's enough to tip the scales. Catherine turned to Mara. Which brings me to the most important question. If I can get you into that courtroom, if I can get you in front of a judge, will you be able to speak up? To tell your story clearly and honestly? Mara nodded, wiping tears from her face. I'll do whatever it takes. Mr. Hale is in jail because of me. All of you are at risk because of me. The least I can do is tell the truth. Good. Then we have a fighting chance. Catherine began gathering her things. I need to ride back to Helena immediately and file the necessary paperwork. With luck, I can get a hearing scheduled within the week. A week, Dutch said quietly. A lot can happen in a week. I know, which is why Mara needs to stay hidden and safe. Mr. Crow is going to be watching this property now, waiting for her to slip up. Catherine looked at the assembled ranchers. Do any of you have a place where she could stay temporarily? Somewhere Crow wouldn't think to look? She can stay with us, Anna Muller said immediately. Our farm is small, not worth Crow's attention. And we have daughters. She can hide among them, just another girl helping with chores. That's risky for you, Catherine warned. Everything is risky now, Jacob Muller replied. But Anna is right. The girl needs somewhere safe, and we can provide it. It was decided quickly. Mara would go with the Mullers, still disguised as a boy for the journey, then resume being herself once safely hidden on their property. The other ranchers would maintain watch and communication, ready to sound the alarm if Crow's men came searching again. As they prepared to leave, Mara approached Dutch Harrison. Mr. Harrison, can you get a message to Mr. Hale? Can you tell him I'm sorry, that I never wanted any of this to happen? Dutch's scarred face softened. He knows that, girl. And he doesn't blame you. None of us do. But he's in jail because of me. He's in jail because he chose to do the right thing. That's on Crow, not you. Don't you forget that. The ranchers dispersed in groups, heading in different directions to avoid drawing attention. Anna and Jacob took Mara with them, the girl hunched in the saddle of Jacob's spare horse, still maintaining her disguise. Dutch remained behind, staring at Ethan's empty house. The morning had started with hope, a plan, a lawyer, a chance at justice. But now Ethan was in custody, the girl was in greater danger than ever, and they were all balanced on a knife's edge between vindication and catastrophe. He thought about what the marshal had said, about enforcing the law even when it was wrong. Dutch understood that sentiment, respected it even. He'd been a soldier once, following orders he didn't always agree with because discipline and order mattered. But there was a difference between military discipline and moral courage. And sometimes, moral courage meant standing against the law when the law had lost its way. As he rode back to his own ranch, Dutch wondered what the next week would bring. Would Catherine Morrison's legal maneuvering work? Would they get Mara in front of a sympathetic judge? Or would Crow's money and influence crush them all? He didn't have answers. All he had was a bone-deep certainty that what they were doing was right, and a hope, fragile but unbreakable, that right would somehow triumph over legal. It had to. Because if it didn't, then everything they believed about justice and freedom and the frontier as a place where people could build better lives, all of it would be revealed as a comforting lie. And Dutch Harrison wasn't ready to accept that, not yet. Not while there was still fight left in him. The jail in Millerville was a squat stone building that smelled of damp earth and human misery. Ethan sat on a narrow cot in the single cell, his wrists still aching from the handcuffs they'd finally removed once he was locked behind bars. Through the small barred window, he could see a sliver of sky turning from blue to gold as evening approached. He'd been here for 3 days. 3 days of uncertainty, of not knowing whether Mara was safe, whether Catherine Morrison had succeeded in filing her petition, whether the network of ranchers was holding together under Crow's scrutiny. Marshal Garrett had allowed him no visitors and no messages, citing concerns about witness tampering. The isolation was calculated, deliberate, a tactic meant to break his spirit and make him more willing to cooperate. It wasn't working. Ethan had endured worse than this. He'd watched his daughter waste away from fever while he stood helpless. He'd buried his wife in frozen ground and spent 7 winters alone with nothing but ghosts for company. A few days in a cell couldn't touch the depths of suffering he'd already survived. But what gnawed at him was the helplessness. Out there, events were unfolding that would determine Mara's fate, and he could do nothing but wait. The sound of the outer door opening pulled him from his thoughts. He heard voices, the deputy on duty and someone else. A woman's voice he didn't immediately recognize. Then footsteps approached his cell, and he looked up to see an unexpected visitor. She was perhaps 45, dressed in the practical but well-made clothing of someone with means and position. Her dark hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a severe bun, and her face bore the kind of weathered dignity that came from years of hard-won authority. But it was her eyes that struck Ethan most. They held a sharpness that missed nothing, and a depth that suggested she'd seen more of life's cruelties than she cared to remember. The deputy unlocked the cell door. "You've got 15 minutes, Judge Blackwood. I'll be right outside if you need anything." "Judge." Ethan stood slowly, his mind racing. This was the territorial judge from Helena, the one Catherine Morrison had petitioned. But why had she come here personally? "Mr. Hale," the woman said, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "I'm Judge Margaret Blackwood. I'd like to speak with you about your case, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Ethan said carefully. "Though I'm surprised to see you here. Don't judges usually stay in their courtrooms?" A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Usually, but Miss Morrison's petition raised questions significant enough that I felt I should investigate personally before making any rulings. I've spoken with several people over the past 2 days, Mr. Crow, Marshal Garrett, some of your neighbors. Now I'd like to hear your side of things." "My side is simple, Your Honor. A 13-year-old girl showed up at my ranch, fleeing a marriage to a man 4 times her age. I chose to protect her. That's the whole story." "Is it?" Judge Blackwood settled herself on the narrow bench opposite Ethan's cot, seemingly unbothered by the grim surroundings. "Mr. Crow tells a different story. He says you're an unstable man, unhinged by the loss of your family, who's fixated on this girl as a replacement for your dead daughter. He says you've kidnapped her and are likely holding her against her will somewhere in that valley of yours." Ethan felt anger flash through him, but kept his voice level. "With respect, Your Honor, Silas Crow is a liar. That girl came to me asking for help, and I gave it. The only person holding anyone against their will is Crow himself, through a contract that treats a child like property." "The contract is legal," the judge pointed out. "Parental authority over minor children is well established in territorial law. Legal doesn't always mean right." "No," Judge Blackwood agreed quietly. "It doesn't, which is why I'm here." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intensifying. "Mr. Hale, I need you to understand something. What you've done, protecting this girl, defying a legal contract, harboring what the law considers stolen property, these are serious crimes. If I uphold the warrant and the charges proceed to trial, you could spend the next 10 years in prison." "I understand that." "Do you? Do you understand that your ranch will be lost, your reputation destroyed, your life essentially over?" "Yes, Your Honor. I understand all of that." "And yet you don't seem particularly concerned." Ethan met her gaze steadily. "Because some things matter more than my freedom or my property. That girl's life, her future, her right to choose her own path, though those things matter more." Judge Blackwood was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "Tell me about your daughter. Emma, wasn't it?" The unexpected shift caught Ethan off guard. What does Emma have to do with this? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Mr. Crow suggests your judgment is clouded by grief. I'd like to know if he's right. Ethan took a slow breath, fighting the familiar ache that always accompanied thoughts of his lost child. Emma died when she was 12. Scarlet fever. There wasn't anything I could do to save her. No medicine, no treatment that worked. I watched her fade for 3 weeks, and at the end I could only hold her hand and lie to her about how everything would be fine. That must have been terrible. It broke something in me. Broke my wife, too. She died 6 months later, and everyone said it was pneumonia. But I knew better. She died because living in a world without Emma was too painful to bear. He paused, then added, "So yes, I lost my daughter. And yes, that loss has shaped how I see the world, but it hasn't clouded my judgment, Your Honor. If anything, it's made my judgment clearer." "How so?" "Because I know what it means to watch a child suffer and be powerless to help. I know what it feels like to fail someone who trusted you to keep them safe. And when Mara showed up at my ranch, when she looked at me with those terrified eyes and said she was too young to be a wife, I saw a chance to do something I couldn't do for Emma. I saw a chance to actually save someone. Even if it meant breaking the law? The law that says a father can sell his 13-year-old daughter to settle a gambling debt? Yes, Your Honor. I'll break that law every time." Judge Blackwood stood and walked to the small window, staring out at the darkening sky. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was sharing something deeply personal. "I was married when I was 14, she said quietly, "to a man my father chose. A business arrangement that benefited him greatly and destroyed my childhood. I had no say in the matter, no choice, no escape. And for the first 5 years of that marriage, I lived in a kind of hell I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy." Ethan felt his breath catch. He'd known the judge was a woman of authority and accomplishment, but he hadn't known this. "When my husband died, thrown from a horse when I was 19, I was finally free. I used the inheritance to educate myself, to study law, to build a life on my own terms. It took me 20 years of fighting and clawing and proving myself before I was appointed to the territorial bench. 20 years to earn the right to make decisions about other people's lives." She turned from the window, and Ethan saw something fierce burning in her eyes. "So when I read Miss Morrison's petition, when I saw this case about a 13-year-old girl being contracted into marriage against her will, it struck very close to home. Then you understand why I did what I did." "I understand the impulse. What I need to determine is whether your actions were justified under the law or whether they constitute criminal behavior that must be punished regardless of motive." "And how do you determine that?" "By talking to the girl herself, which is why I've ordered her to appear before me tomorrow morning for a private hearing. Miss Morrison assures me she knows where the girl is hidden and will produce her." Ethan's heart leaped. "Mara's going to testify?" "If Miss Morrison can indeed produce her, yes. I want to hear directly from the child about whether she was kidnapped and held against her will, or whether she sought refuge of her own accord. I want to understand what she wants for her own life, regardless of what her father or Mr. Crow might want. She'll tell you the truth, Your Honor. She's the bravest person I've ever met." "We'll see." Judge Blackwood moved toward the cell door, then paused. "One more question, Mr. Hale. If I rule against you, if I determine that the contract is valid and the girl must be returned to Mr. Crow's custody, will you accept that ruling?" It was a test, Ethan realized. The wrong answer could doom everything, but he'd never been good at lying, and he wasn't about to start now. "Honestly, Your Honor, I don't know. I want to say I'd respect the court's decision, but if that decision means sending a child into a situation I know will harm her..." He trailed off, then finished quietly. "I'd like to think I'm a law-abiding man. But I'm a decent man first, and sometimes those two things conflict." Judge Blackwood studied him for a long moment, her expression inscrutable. Then, surprisingly, she nodded. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Hale. I'll see you tomorrow at the hearing." She left, and Ethan sank back onto his cot, his mind whirling. Tomorrow. Everything would be decided tomorrow. Mara would stand before a judge and speak her truth, and that truth would either set them all free or condemn them to ruin. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to hope. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost coating the windows of the makeshift courtroom in Millerville's town hall. The building was packed with spectators, ranchers and townspeople, curious onlookers and partisan supporters, all crammed into the small space to witness what everyone knew would be a defining moment. Ethan was brought in handcuffed, flanked by 2 deputies. He scanned the crowd and found familiar faces: Dutch Harrison and his wife, Samuel Cord, Jacob and Anna Mueller, Tom and James Ridley. They'd all come to bear witness, to stand with him even if only in presence. And there, seated in the front row beside Catherine Morrison, was Mara. She'd abandoned her boy's disguise and was dressed in a simple but clean dress that Anna Mueller must have provided. Her short hair had been neatly trimmed and combed, and someone had scrubbed her face until it shone. She looked impossibly young sitting there, small and vulnerable, and Ethan felt his chest tighten with protective fury. On the opposite side of the room sat Silas Crow, dressed in his finest suit, flanked by two lawyers who looked expensive and competent. Crow's face was composed, confident, the face of a man who believed the law was on his side and victory was assured. Judge Blackwood entered through a side door, and everyone rose. She took her seat behind a makeshift bench, really just a table draped with a cloth bearing the territorial seal, and surveyed the assembled crowd with sharp eyes. "This is an informal hearing," she began, her voice carrying authority despite the unusual setting. "I'm here to gather testimony and make preliminary rulings on two matters. First, whether the charges against Ethan Hale are substantiated and should proceed to trial. Second, whether the marriage contract between Silas Crow and Mara Brennan is valid and enforceable under territorial law." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Judge Blackwood raised a hand for silence. "I'll hear from the principals in this matter directly. Mr. Crow, since you're the complainant, you may speak first." Crow stood, his bearing confident and his voice smooth as silk. "Thank you, Your Honor. The facts of this case are straightforward. Thomas Brennan, father of Mara Brennan, entered into a legal and binding contract with me. In exchange for the forgiveness of substantial debts, $5,000, he agreed to give his daughter's hand in marriage. This contract was witnessed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. It is in every respect a valid legal document. When the girl disappeared days before our wedding, I naturally sought to recover my intended bride. My investigations led me to believe that Ethan Hale had kidnapped her and was holding her against her will. I swore out a complaint, Marshal Garrett investigated, and Mr. Hale was arrested. Now I simply ask that the court uphold the law, return my property to me, and punish those who broke the law by harboring her." He sat down, looking satisfied. Judge Blackwood made a note, then turned to Catherine Morrison. "Miss Morrison, you represent Mr. Hale." "I do, Your Honor. And I'd like to address Mr. Crow's characterization of Miss Brennan as his property. She is not property. She is a human being, a child, entitled to fundamental rights that cannot be signed away by a parent, no matter how much debt that parent has incurred." "The law says otherwise," one of Crow's lawyers interjected. "The law is evolving," Catherine shot back, "and this court has the authority to determine whether a contract violates public policy, even if it appears facially valid. I submit that any contract that treats a 13-year-old child as a commodity to be traded for debt relief is fundamentally void as against public policy." Judge Blackwood held up a hand. "Save the legal arguments for later, Miss Morrison. Right now, I want to hear from the girl herself." She gestured to Mara. "Miss Brennan, please approach." Mara stood on shaking legs and walked to the front of the room. She looked impossibly small standing there before the judge, before Crow, before the assembled crowd. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I have several questions for you, and I need you to answer them honestly. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor." "First, did Ethan Hale kidnap you?" "No, Your Honor. I went to his ranch of my own free will, asking for help." "Why did you need help?" Mara's hands clenched at her sides. "Because my father had sold me to Mr. Crow to pay off his gambling debts. The wedding was scheduled, and I was terrified." "Terrified of what?" "Of being married to a man I didn't know, who was 4 times my age, who looked at me in ways that made my skin crawl. Of being trapped in a situation I had no power to escape." Crow surged to his feet. "This is nonsense. The girl is being coached to say these things." "Mr. Crow, sit down," Judge Blackwood said sharply. "You'll have your chance to respond." Crow sat, his face flushed with anger. The judge turned back to Mara. "Did anyone coach you to say those words?" "No, Your Honor. They're the truth. My truth." "Tell me about the night you left your father's house. What happened?" Mara took a deep breath, and then the story poured out of her. She spoke of her father's gambling, of Crow's initial visit to their home, of the contract being signed while she stood by helplessly. She spoke of Crow's cold assessment of her, his comments about breaking her spirit, his thinly veiled threats about what would happen after they were married. My Aunt Margaret, my father's sister, she couldn't stand to see it happen. She drove me to Mr. Hale's ranch in secret, begging him to hide me, and he agreed even though he knew it would put him in danger. Why did you go to Mr. Hale specifically? Judge Blackwood asked. Because Aunt Margaret said he was a good man who'd lost his own daughter. She thought he might understand, might be willing to help when others wouldn't. And was she right? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Hale took me in without hesitation. He fed me, protected me, taught me how to hide when searchers came. He never asked for anything in return. He just helped me because it was the right thing to do. Judge Blackwood leaned back in her chair, studying Mara's face. Here's what I need to understand, Miss Brennan. You're 13 years old. Your father has legal authority over you until you reach your majority. By what right do you refuse a marriage he's arranged? The question hung in the air, challenging not just Mara but the very foundation of parental authority. The room fell silent, everyone waiting for her answer. Mara straightened her shoulders, and when she spoke, her voice carried a conviction that belied her years. By the right of being a human being with a soul and a mind of my own. My father may have legal authority, but that doesn't make him right. He sold me to pay his debts. He chose gambling over my welfare, money over my future. And the law might say he's allowed to do that, but that doesn't make it just. Strong words from someone so young. I've had to grow up fast, Your Honor. When the adults in your life fail you, you either give up or you fight. I chose to fight. Judge Blackwood was silent for a long moment. Then she said, Let me ask you directly, Miss Brennan. Do you consent to marry Silas Crow? No, Your Honor. I do not consent. I will never consent. I'm too young to be anyone's wife, and even if I wasn't, I would never choose to marry that man. That man? Judge Blackwood gestured to Crow. Why not? By all accounts, he's wealthy, established, capable of providing for you. Because he doesn't want a wife. He wants a possession, something young and malleable that he can shape to his will. And I refuse to be that for him or for anyone. Crow couldn't contain himself any longer. He stood again, his voice shaking with rage. This is absurd. The girl is a child who doesn't know her own mind. Of course she's frightened of marriage. All young brides are nervous. But that's no reason to void a legal contract. Mr. Crow, Judge Blackwood said coldly, I don't recall inviting you to speak. Sit down or I'll have you removed from this hearing. Crow sat, but his face was mottled with fury. The judge turned back to Mara. You've made your position very clear, Miss Brennan, but I need to ask you something else. If I rule that the contract is valid, that you must honor your father's agreement, what will you do? Mara's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. I'll run, Your Honor. I'll run as far and as fast as I can, and I'll keep running until either I'm free or I'm dead. But I won't marry Silas Crow. Not willingly. Not ever. The bluntness of that statement seemed to shake even Judge Blackwood. She studied Mara for a long moment, then said quietly, You may sit down. As Mara returned to her seat beside Catherine Morrison, the judge called Ethan forward. Mr. Hale, you heard Miss Brennan's testimony. Do you have anything to add? Ethan had spent the last 3 days in jail thinking about what he would say if given the chance. He'd composed speeches in his mind, crafted arguments about justice and morality and the difference between law and right. But now, standing before the judge with Mara's testimony still echoing in the room, all those prepared words seemed inadequate. Your Honor, I'm just a rancher. I don't know much about law or contracts or legal authority, but I know right from wrong. And selling a 13-year-old girl to settle a gambling debt, that's wrong. It doesn't matter if there's a contract or not. It doesn't matter if the law technically allows it. It's wrong, and I wasn't going to stand by and let it happen. Even if standing against it meant breaking the law yourself? Yes, Your Honor, even then. That's a dangerous philosophy, Mr. Hale. If everyone decided for themselves which laws to follow, we'd have chaos. Maybe. But if we follow laws that are fundamentally unjust, if we use legal authority to justify cruelty, then what kind of society are we building? What kind of world are we leaving for the next generation? Judge Blackwood was quiet for a moment, then asked, If I release you from custody but order you to stay away from Miss Brennan to allow her to be returned to her father's custody, will you comply? It was the same test she'd posed in the jail cell, but this time there was a courtroom full of witnesses. Ethan knew his answer could determine everything. "No, Your Honor, I won't." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Catherine Morrison looked alarmed. "You're refusing a direct order from this court?" Judge Blackwood asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I'm saying that some things matter more than my obedience to a law I believe is unjust. If you rule that Mara must be returned to Crow, I'll fight that ruling with every legal means available. But if those legal means fail, if the law says she must be forced into this marriage, then yes, I'll break that law. I'll help her run, hide her, do whatever it takes to keep her free. You understand that's contempt of court? That I could have you imprisoned indefinitely?" "I understand, Your Honor, but I'd rather spend the rest of my life in prison with a clear conscience than spend one day free knowing I'd abandoned that girl to a fate she didn't choose and doesn't deserve." The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. Judge Blackwood slammed her hand on the table for silence. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom." When the room quieted, she turned to Crow. "Mr. Crow, I have a question for you. Why do you want to marry this particular girl?" Crow blinked, seemingly taken aback by the directness of the question. We have a contract. The agreement was made in good faith. That's not what I asked. Why this girl specifically? You're a wealthy man. You could marry any number of women who would willingly accept your proposal. Why insist on a 13-year-old child who clearly wants nothing to do with you?" Crow's face darkened. "The girl's feelings are irrelevant. Her father gave his word, and I expect that word to be honored." "But why?" Judge Blackwood pressed. "What possible reason could you have for insisting on this match, when the girl herself is so opposed to it?" Crow's mask of civility finally cracked. "Because I paid for her. I forgave $5,000 in debt. That's real money, real value. And in return, I was promised a young, unspoiled bride who could give me children and manage my household. That was the bargain, and I intend to collect what I'm owed." The words hung in the air, ugly and revealing. In that moment, Crow had confirmed everything Mara and her defenders had claimed. He didn't see her as a person, but as a commodity he'd purchased. Judge Blackwood's face could have been carved from stone. "What you're owed," she repeated quietly. "Mr. Crow, I've been a judge for 7 years. In that time, I've heard countless cases and made countless rulings. But I've never heard anything quite as repulsive as what you just said." Crow seemed to realize his mistake. "Your Honor, I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said. You view this child as property you purchased, and you're demanding delivery of your goods. Well, Mr. Crow, I have news for you. Children are not goods. They are not property, and no contract, however legal it may appear, can change that fundamental truth." She stood, and everyone in the room rose with her. "I'm issuing several rulings," Judge Blackwood announced. "First, all charges against Ethan Hale are dismissed. He did not kidnap Miss Brennan. She sought refuge with him of her own free will, and he provided that refuge in service of a higher moral obligation. Relief flooded through Ethan so powerfully he nearly staggered. Second, the marriage contract between Silas Crow and Mara Brennan is hereby declared void as against public policy. No court in this territory should enforce a contract that treats a child as a commodity to be bought and sold." Crow shot to his feet. "You can't do that. The contract is legal." "The contract may be legal, Mr. Crow, but it is not enforceable. There's a difference. And I am exercising my authority to refuse to enforce a contract that violates fundamental principles of human dignity. I'll appeal this. I'll take it to the Territorial Supreme Court." "You do that," Judge Blackwood said calmly. "But until such time as a higher court overturns my ruling, this contract is void." She turned to Mara. "Miss Brennan, I'm placing you under the temporary guardianship of—" She paused, scanning the courtroom. Then her eyes settled on Anna Mueller. "Mrs. Anna Mueller, who has testified to her willingness to provide you with a safe home and proper education. Your father's parental rights are suspended pending a full review of his fitness." "You can't take away a father's rights," one of Crow's lawyers objected. "I can, and I have," Judge Blackwood replied. "Mr. Brennan sold his daughter to pay gambling debts. That demonstrates such a fundamental failure of parental duty that I have no choice but to intervene. If he wishes to challenge my ruling, he may file an appeal." She gathered her papers, then addressed the entire courtroom. Let this case serve as a reminder that the law is meant to serve justice, not to facilitate injustice. When contracts or statutes are used to perpetrate harm against the vulnerable, it is the duty of the courts to stand as a bulwark against that harm. This hearing is adjourned. The room erupted in chaos. Some people cheering, others protesting, everyone talking at once. But Ethan heard none of it. He was watching Mara, who had collapsed into Anna Muller's arms, sobbing with relief. Catherine Morrison was shaking his hand, congratulating him, explaining the technical brilliance of Judge Blackwood's rulings. Dutch Harrison was pounding him on the back. Other ranchers were crowding around, offering their support and celebration. But Ethan's eyes kept returning to Mara, this brave child who'd stood before a judge and demanded her right to choose her own life. She'd won. They'd all won. Not through violence or deception, but through truth spoken plainly in a courtroom, heard by a judge who'd had the courage to rule with her conscience rather than her legal precedents. Silas Crowe stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyers trailing behind, already discussing appeals and legal strategies. But everyone knew it was over. Judge Blackwood's ruling had stripped away the veneer of legality that had protected Crowe's intentions, exposed them for what they truly were: the exploitation of a child by a powerful man who believed his money entitled him to anything he wanted. As the crowd began to disperse, Mara broke free from Anna Mueller and ran to Ethan. She threw her arms around him, and he held her while she wept, murmuring soothing words that meant nothing and everything. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Thank you for being brave enough to speak your truth," he replied. "You did this, Mara. You stood up there and told that judge exactly who you are and what you deserve. That took more courage than anything I've ever done." Judge Blackwood approached them, and Mara straightened, wiping her eyes. "Miss Brennan," the judge said gently, "you have a remarkable spirit. Don't ever let anyone break that." "I won't, Your Honor. I promise." The judge turned to Ethan. "Mr. Hale, you took an enormous risk protecting this girl. You could have lost everything." "I know, but she was worth the risk." "Yes," Judge Blackwood agreed. "She was. I hope you'll stay in her life, Mr. Hale. She's going to need good people around her as she grows up." "I intend to, Your Honor, if she'll have me." Mara grabbed his hand. "Always," she said fiercely. "Your family, now." As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright Montana sunshine, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 long years: peace. Not the peace of resignation or the peace of surrender, but the peace that came from knowing he'd done the right thing, regardless of cost. Mara was safe. She was free. And together, along with all the good people who'd stood beside them, they'd proven that sometimes truth really could triumph over power. Sometimes, if you had the courage to fight for it, justice could win. The celebration that followed Judge Blackwood's ruling was tempered by caution. Everyone knew that Silas Crowe wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and his lawyers had already filed notice of appeal before the sun set that day. But for the moment, standing in the street outside the courthouse with Mara safe beside him and friends surrounding them both, Ethan allowed himself to feel something close to joy. Dutch Harrison organized an impromptu gathering at his ranch that evening, and nearly everyone who'd stood with them during the ordeal came. Tables were set up in the yard, food appeared from various kitchens, and for a few hours the valley community forgot about the threat still looming and simply celebrated a victory that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Ethan found himself standing apart from the crowd, watching Mara laugh at something one of the Mueller daughters had said. She looked different now, lighter somehow, as if Judge Blackwood's ruling had lifted a weight she'd been carrying since her father first told her about the arrangement with Crowe. Her short hair had begun to grow out in soft waves, and Anna Mueller had found her clothes that actually fit properly. She was still just a child, but she was a child who'd been given back her future. "You did good, Ethan," a voice said beside him. He turned to find Catherine Morrison, the lawyer who'd made all of this possible through her legal maneuvering and unwavering advocacy. "We all did," Ethan corrected. "I just provided a place to hide. You're the one who found the legal pathway out." Catherine shook her head. "Legal pathways only work if someone has the courage to walk them. You gave that girl sanctuary when no one else would. That took backbone most men don't have." "I did what anyone should have done." But most people wouldn't have. That's the point. She paused, then added more seriously, "You should know that Crow's appeal has teeth. He's hired one of the best legal minds in the territory, and they're arguing that Judge Blackwood overstepped her authority. They're saying she can't void a contract just because she personally finds it distasteful." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. What are the chances they'll succeed? Honestly, maybe 50-50. Judge Blackwood's ruling was bold, maybe too bold for the territorial Supreme Court to uphold. They tend to be conservative on questions of parental authority and contract law. Catherine met his eyes. But here's what matters. Even if they overturn her ruling on the contract, they can't change her dismissal of the criminal charges against you. You're free, and you'll stay free. And Mara's guardianship arrangement stands until someone successfully challenges it, which could take months or years. So she's safe, at least for now? As safe as we can make her. The Mullers have legal custody, and they're good people. They'll protect her while the appeals process plays out. Catherine smiled slightly. And between you and me, I don't think Crow has the stomach for a protracted legal fight. His reputation took a serious hit when Judge Blackwood called him out in open court. People are talking about how he views children as property he can purchase. That kind of talk is bad for business. I hope you're right. Time will tell, but for tonight, try to enjoy this. You earned it. Catherine moved away to join the other guests, and Ethan was left with his thoughts. He understood the precarious nature of their victory, built on one judge's courage and vulnerable to reversal by higher courts. But he also understood that something fundamental had shifted. Mara had spoken her truth in a public forum, and that truth had resonated with people. Word of the hearing was spreading through the territory, carried by those who'd witnessed it and embellished by those who hadn't. The story was becoming legend, a young girl standing up to power, a rancher risking everything to protect her, a judge brave enough to do what was right instead of what was easy. Stories like that mattered. They changed how people thought about law and justice and the obligations they owed to each other. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit around Dutch's yard, Ethan found himself drawn into conversation with the other ranchers. They talked about crops and weather, about cattle prices and water rights. But underneath the mundane topics ran a current of something deeper, a shared understanding that they'd all crossed a line together, and that crossing had bound them into something more than just neighbors. They'd become a community in the truest sense, united by common values rather than just common geography. Later, when many of the families had departed for home, Mara approached Ethan where he sat on Dutch's porch. She settled beside him, her legs dangling off the edge, and for a while they simply sat in comfortable silence. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now you go live with the Muellers. You go to school, you learn, you grow up. You get to be a child for a while longer. And you, what happens to you?" Ethan considered the question. His ranch still needed work. His life was still solitary in many ways. But something had changed in him over these past weeks. The grief that had defined him for 7 years hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted somehow, made room for other feelings. Purpose, connection, hope. "I go back to my ranch," he said. "I do my work, and I stay close enough that if you ever need anything, I'm there." "Like family?" "Exactly like family." Mara leaned against his shoulder, and Ethan was struck by how natural the gesture felt. He'd lost his daughter, and this girl wasn't a replacement for Emma. No one could be. But she was something else, something equally precious. She was proof that grief didn't have to be the end of the story, that loss could coexist with love, that helping someone else could heal wounds you thought would never close. "I'm going to make you proud," Mara said quietly. "I'm going to study hard, learn everything I can, and someday I'm going to be a teacher just like Aunt Margaret, and I'm going to help other girls who need someone to stand up for them." "You already make me proud," Ethan replied, "every single day." The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Mara settled into life with the Muller family, sharing a room with their 2 daughters and throwing herself into her studies with fierce determination. Anna Muller reported that the girl devoured books like a starving person at a feast, reading everything she could get her hands on and asking questions that would challenge scholars twice her age. Ethan visited regularly, always finding some excuse. He needed Jacob's advice on a fence repair. He had extra vegetables from his garden to share. He was passing through on his way to town. Everyone knew the real reason, and no one minded. Watching Ethan and Mara together, seeing the bond that had formed between them, reminded people of what they'd fought for and why it had mattered. Silas Crow's appeal moved slowly through the legal system, as such things always did. In the meantime, the man himself seemed to retreat from public life. His businesses continued operating, but he rarely showed his face in Millerville anymore. Rumor had it that he had taken up residence in Helena, where people didn't know about the scandal, and he could conduct his affairs without being reminded of his public humiliation. Thomas Brennan, Mara's father, had disappeared entirely. Some said he'd gone east, fleeing his shame. Others claimed he'd headed west to California, seeking his fortune in the gold fields. Mara never asked about him, and Ethan didn't volunteer information. Some absences were blessings in disguise. As autumn gave way to winter, Ethan found himself invited to Sunday dinners at various ranches throughout the valley. Dutch and his wife had him over regularly, as did the Cords and the Ridleys. Even old Walter Chen insisted Ethan visit his small farm to sample his wife's cooking. These gatherings felt significant, like he was being woven back into the fabric of community life after years of self-imposed isolation. During one particularly cold December evening at the Mullers' farm, Ethan sat by the fire with Jacob while the women and children worked in the kitchen preparing supper. Jacob puffed on his pipe, the smoke curling toward the rafters. "I have been thinking," Jacob said in his accented English, "about what we did, about standing against Crow and the law." "Having regrets?" Ethan asked. No, opposite of regrets. I am thinking we should have done something like this sooner, not wait for crisis to bring us together." He gestured with his pipe toward the kitchen, where laughter echoed. "We live close to each other. We share this valley, but before Mara came, we were strangers who happened to be neighbors. Now we are something more." "A community," Ethan said. "Ja, exactly. A community. And I'm thinking, what if we make this permanent? What if we form a council, something official, where we help each other and watch out for injustice before it becomes crisis?" The idea took root in Ethan's mind. Like a valley association? Something like that. We could meet once a month, share news and problems, help those who are struggling. Make sure no one faces trouble alone. Jacob's eyes were bright with the possibility. "What do you think?" "I think it's exactly what we need." The Valley Alliance, as it came to be called, held its first official meeting in January at the schoolhouse. 15 families sent representatives, and together they drafted a simple charter. They would support each other in times of hardship, advocate for just laws in the territorial legislature, and stand together against anyone who tried to exploit the vulnerable among them. It wasn't a revolution. It was simply people deciding to care about each other and formalize that caring into something durable, but in its own way that was more powerful than any single dramatic act. It was sustainability, the long-term commitment that turned one brave moment into a lasting change. Catherine Morrison attended that first meeting, having stayed in the area to monitor Crow's appeal. She brought news that made everyone sit up straighter. "Crow's withdrawn his appeal," she announced. "As of this morning, he's officially dropped all legal action related to the marriage contract in Mara's custody." The room erupted in questions and exclamations. Catherine raised her hands for silence. "I don't know all the details, but my sources suggest that several of Crow's business partners pressured him to let it go. The scandal was affecting their operations, and they made it clear that continuing the fight would cost him more than the girl was worth to him." She paused, then added with satisfaction, "Apparently, there are limits to how much bad publicity even powerful men can weather." Ethan felt relief wash through him so powerfully it left him dizzy. It was truly over. Mara was truly safe. The legal threats that had hung over them all were gone, dissolved not by force, but by social pressure and economic calculation. "What about her father's parental rights?" Anna Muller asked. "Are those still suspended?" "Judge Blackwood's ruling stands. Unless Thomas Brennan returns and successfully petitions for restoration of his rights, which seems unlikely given that he's fled the territory, Mara remains under your guardianship until she reaches majority." Anna's face showed fierce satisfaction. "Good. That is good." After the meeting, as people filed out into the cold January night, Mara found Ethan in the crowd. She'd grown in the months since the hearing, her face losing some of its childish softness and beginning to show hints of the woman she would become. "It's really over?" she asked. "Mr. Crow isn't going to try to take me anymore?" "It's really over," Ethan confirmed. "You're free, Mara, completely free." She threw her arms around him in an impulsive hug, and Ethan held her, marveling at how far they'd both come since that dusky evening when she'd first appeared at his ranch, frightened and desperate. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. "Yes, you could have. You're the strongest person I know, but I'm glad you didn't have to do it alone." The months turned into years with the steady inevitability of seasons changing. Mara flourished under the Mueller's care, excelling in her studies and becoming an integral part of their family while maintaining her close bond with Ethan. She spent weekends and summers at his ranch, helping with chores and filling the old house with conversation and laughter. During those visits, Ethan taught her practical skills: how to mend fences, how to read the weather, how to gentle a skittish horse. But more importantly, they talked. About her dreams of becoming a teacher, about the books she was reading, about the world she hoped to help build. Ethan found himself seeing the future through her eyes, and it looked brighter than anything he'd imagined possible during those dark years after Emma's death. The valley continued to change as well. The alliance grew stronger, attracting new families who were drawn by the community's reputation for looking out for its members. They established a lending library, organized barn raisings for newcomers, and successfully lobbied the territorial legislature for a new school building. Judge Margaret Blackwood visited twice more, officially to review Mara's custody arrangement, but really, Ethan suspected, to see how the girl was progressing. Each time she seemed pleased with what she found, a thriving child becoming an educated young woman, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could be worth to them. On her second visit, the judge pulled Ethan aside for a private conversation. "You know," she said, "I've presided over hundreds of cases in my years on the bench. Most of them blur together after a while. But I'll never forget this one. Never forget that girl standing in front of me saying she was too young to be a wife, or you saying you'd break the law before you'd let her be harmed." "We just did what was right," Ethan said. "That's rarer than you think. Most people know what's right but lack the courage to act on it. You had that courage, and it made all the difference." She paused, then added, "Cases like this are why I became a judge. To stand between power and vulnerability, to give voice to those who otherwise wouldn't be heard. Thank you for reminding me why that matters." When Mara turned 16, the Mullers organized a birthday celebration that drew half the valley. She'd grown tall and confident, her short hair now long enough to braid, her eyes still holding that fierce intelligence that had first struck Ethan. She'd become fluent in German from living with the Muellers, had read her way through every book in the lending library, and had already been accepted as a teacher's apprentice at the new school that would open the following fall. During the celebration, she sought out Ethan where he stood on the edge of the crowd, watching the festivities with quiet satisfaction. "I want to show you something," she said, leading him to a quiet corner of the barn. From her pocket, she withdrew a folded piece of paper, carefully preserved and obviously precious to her. Ethan unfolded it and found himself looking at a letter of acceptance from the Montana Territorial Normal School, the training institution for teachers. The letter was dated for the following year, after she completed her apprenticeship. "Anna and Jacob are going to help with tuition," Mara explained, her voice bright with excitement. "And I've been saving money from tutoring the younger children. I'll be able to attend for 2 full years, get my teaching certificate, and then I can work anywhere in the territory." "Mara, that's wonderful. Your Aunt Margaret would be so proud." "I think she would be. I wish I could tell her, but she moved to California last year and we've lost touch." Mara's expression grew more serious. "But I wanted to tell you first, before anyone else, because none of this would have been possible if you hadn't given me a chance at a future." "You gave yourself that chance. You stood up and fought for it." "Maybe, but I couldn't have fought alone." She reached out and took his hand. "When I was 13 and everything seemed hopeless, you were the only person who saw me as someone worth saving. Not because of what I could give you or what I was worth in a contract, but just because I was a person who deserved better. That changed everything for me." Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. You changed everything for me too. I was barely living before you showed up, just going through the motions, counting down the days until I could join Emma and Sarah. But you reminded me that life is worth living, that there are still people worth fighting for." They stood together in the quiet barn, the sounds of celebration muted by distance, and Ethan thought about the strange path that had brought them to this moment. If Mara's father hadn't gambled away his fortune, if Crow hadn't proposed his terrible contract, if Margaret Brennan hadn't had the courage to drive her niece to a stranger's ranch, none of this would have happened. The community wouldn't have been forged in the fire of standing together, Ethan wouldn't have found his way back from grief, and Mara wouldn't have discovered the strength she'd needed to claim her own life. It was a terrible thing to acknowledge, that sometimes good could come from bad, that redemption could grow from ashes. But it was also true. The years continued their steady march. Mara completed her apprenticeship and attended the normal school, excelling in her studies and returning each summer to work in the Valley School. She was a natural teacher, firm but kind, demanding but patient, with a particular gift for reaching students who struggled or felt overlooked. Ethan watched her blossom into the woman she was meant to be, and with each passing year he felt his own grief transform into something softer, more bearable. He would always miss Emma and Sarah. That hole in his heart would never completely heal, but it no longer consumed him. He'd found a way to honor their memory by living fully, by caring for others, by being the kind of man who could be counted on when someone needed help. The ranch prospered modestly under his renewed attention. He hired a young man from town to help with the heavier work, and together they expanded the operation, adding new pastures and improving the livestock. It would never make him wealthy, but it provided a comfortable life and kept him connected to the land he loved. Dutch Harrison often joked that Ethan had become the valley's unofficial conscience, the person people turned to when they needed advice or support. Ethan deflected the praise, but he couldn't deny that his role in the community had evolved. People trusted him, respected him, sought his counsel. It was a responsibility he took seriously, always remembering that his credibility had been earned by standing up for what was right when it would have been easier to look away. When Mara turned 21, she received her teaching certificate and her first official appointment as the head teacher at the Valley School that had been built largely because of the Alliance's advocacy. The position came with a small house adjacent to the schoolyard, and Mara moved in with characteristic determination, decorating the space with books and maps and a photograph of her Aunt Margaret that she'd somehow managed to obtain. Ethan helped her move, carrying boxes of supplies and setting up furniture. As they worked, he marveled at how completely she'd transformed from that frightened 13-year-old into this confident, educated woman with a clear sense of purpose. "You know," Mara said as they took a break on the porch of her new house, "I've been thinking about writing a book, about what happened, about the hearing and Judge Blackwood's ruling. I think there are lessons in it that other people need to hear." "That's ambitious." "Maybe, but I remember what it felt like to be powerless, to have adults making decisions about my life without considering what I wanted or needed. And I know there are other children out there in similar situations, being traded or sold or forced into arrangements they never agreed to. If sharing my story could help even one of them find the courage to speak up, wouldn't it be worth doing?" "It would," Ethan agreed. "Though you should know that telling the story will mean reliving all of it, the fear, the uncertainty, the fight." "I know, but I'm not that scared girl anymore. I'm strong enough now to face it." She looked at him with those clear, intelligent eyes. "Will you help me? I want to make sure I get your part of the story right, what you risked, why you chose to help me." "I'll help however I can." Over the following months, Mara worked on her book in the evenings after her teaching duties were done. She interviewed everyone who'd been involved, Ethan and the Mullers, Dutch and the other ranchers, even Catherine Morrison, who provided copies of legal documents and her own recollections of the case. Writing the book forced Mara to confront details she'd tried to forget, but it also gave her a framework for understanding her own story. She wasn't just a victim who'd been saved, she was a person who'd fought for her own freedom with whatever tools she had available, who'd spoken truth to power even when she was terrified, who'd refused to accept a fate others had chosen for her. The manuscript took 2 years to complete. When it was finally published by a small press in Helena, it created ripples far beyond what any of them had anticipated. The story of a 13-year-old girl standing up to a powerful man, supported by ordinary people willing to risk everything for justice, resonated with readers across the territory and beyond. Newspapers reprinted excerpts. Other lawyers began citing Judge Blackwood's ruling in similar cases. Legislators proposed bills to restrict the circumstances under which children could be contracted into marriage. It wasn't a revolution, but it was change, real, measurable change that would make life better for children who came after. Mara's book brought her invitations to speak at schools and community gatherings throughout the territory. She accepted many of them, traveling during summer months to share her story and encourage others to stand up against injustice. Everywhere she went, she emphasized the same message: that ordinary people doing the right thing could accomplish extraordinary things, that the law was meant to serve justice rather than replace it, and that children deserve to have their voices heard. On one of these speaking tours, she returned to Millerville for the first time since the hearing. The town had changed in the intervening years. Silas Crow had sold most of his holdings and moved permanently to the East Coast, his businesses absorbed by other entrepreneurs. The community seemed lighter without his looming presence, more willing to challenge authority and question arrangements that might once have gone unexamined. Mara's speech at the Millerville Town Hall drew a standing-room-only crowd. She spoke for an hour, telling her story with eloquence and passion, then opened the floor for questions. An elderly woman in the back raised her hand. "I remember when you disappeared," the woman said. "There was such a fuss, and most people assumed you were being selfish, running away from a perfectly good marriage to an important man. But hearing you tell it now, I understand how wrong we were. How could we have been so blind?" Mara's answer was gentle but firm. Because powerful men shape the stories we tell ourselves. Mr. Crow was respected and wealthy, so people assumed his intentions must be honorable. My father had authority over me as my parent, so people assumed he must be acting in my best interest. It's easier to trust the systems we have than to question whether those systems might be broken. "But you questioned them," another voice called out, "even though you were just a child." "Because I had to. Because if I didn't question them, I'd have been trapped in a nightmare. Sometimes the people with the most at stake see the truth most clearly, even if they don't have the power to act on it alone. That's why communities matter. They give individuals the support they need to stand up against injustice." The conversations continued long after the formal speech ended. People wanted to share their own stories, their own experiences with powerlessness, and with finding the courage to resist. Mara listened to each one with the same attention she gave her students, offering encouragement and practical advice. Watching from the back of the hall, Ethan felt pride surge through him. This was what he'd hoped for when he first sheltered that frightened girl, that she'd have the chance to grow, to learn, to become who she was meant to be. But she'd exceeded every hope he'd had, transforming her own suffering into a catalyst for change that reached far beyond the valley where it had begun. After the event, as they rode back toward the valley together, Mara was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "Thank you for coming with me today. I wasn't sure I could face Millerville alone. You didn't need me there. You handled it beautifully." "Maybe. But it helped knowing you were there, that I wasn't facing it alone." She paused, then added, "I've been offered a position at the Territorial Normal School where I trained. They want me to teach their pedagogy classes and develop curriculum for rural schools." Ethan felt happiness and sadness war within him. That's a tremendous opportunity. It is. It would mean moving to Helena, being away from the valley and the people I love. But it would also mean reaching more students, having a bigger impact. She looked at him. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should do whatever calls to you most strongly. You've earned the right to choose your own path, Mara. Don't let anyone else, including me, make that choice for you." She smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "You know what's strange? For years I dreamed about being free, about having choices. And now that I have them, making those choices is terrifying. That's because freedom comes with responsibility. You're not just choosing for yourself, you're choosing what kind of impact you want to have on the world. That's heavy stuff." "What would you choose if you were me?" Ethan thought carefully before answering. "I'd choose the thing that lets me help the most people. You've already proven you can make a difference in a single classroom, but if you can make a difference in how teachers across the territory are trained, think about how many children's lives you could touch. That seems worth the sacrifice of leaving home." Mara nodded slowly. "That's what I think too. but I wanted to hear you say it, to know I wasn't just running toward something new because I'm restless. You're running toward your purpose. There's nothing wrong with that. She accepted the position at the normal school, and the Valley threw her a farewell celebration that rivaled any wedding or harvest festival they'd ever held. People came from farms and ranches throughout the region to wish her well, to thank her for what she'd taught their children, to express their pride in seeing one of their own achieve such success. During the celebration, Anna Muller pulled Ethan aside, tears streaming down her weathered face. "She's like daughter to me," Anna said in her thick accent. "I love her like I love my own girls, but I'm happy she goes to do this important work. Is that strange?" "It's not strange at all," Ethan assured her. "That's what love looks like when it's healthy, wanting the best for someone even when it means letting them go." "You feel this too, Ya, about her leaving?" Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He'd known this day would come, had actively encouraged it even, but that didn't make the parting any easier. Mara had become the center around which his renewed life revolved, and her absence would leave a hole he'd have to learn to navigate. But it was a different kind of hole than the one Emma's death had left. That had been torn by tragedy, by loss that served no purpose and taught no lessons. This was a space created by growth, by someone he loved moving forward into the life they were meant to live. It hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that came from love rather than from its absence. On the morning Mara was scheduled to depart for Helena, Ethan rode to the schoolhouse where she was finishing her packing. She looked up as he entered, and he saw in her face both excitement for what lay ahead and sadness at what she was leaving behind. "I wanted to give you something," Ethan said, holding out a small wooden box he'd spent weeks crafting. "For your new home." Mara opened it carefully and found inside a collection of items. A pressed flower from Emma's grave, a photograph of Sarah and Emma together that Ethan had treasured for years, a smooth river stone from the creek that ran through his property, and a letter written in his careful hand. "Read the letter when you're settled," he said. "But the other things are just reminders. You're carrying part of this valley with you, part of all of us. You're never really alone, no matter how far you travel." She clutched the box to her chest, tears flowing freely now. "I'm going to miss you so much. You've been more of a father to me than my real father ever was. And you've been the light that brought me back from darkness. We're even." They embraced, and Ethan allowed himself to hold on perhaps a moment longer than necessary, memorizing the feeling of this young woman he'd helped raise, this remarkable person he'd had the privilege of knowing. "Make me proud," he whispered. "I will. I promise." After Mara left for Helena, the valley settled into a new rhythm. Ethan continued his work on the ranch, continued his involvement with the Alliance, continued to be the person people turned to when they needed steady advice. But there was an emptiness in his days that hadn't been there before, a quiet that reminded him uncomfortably of those years right after Sarah's death. He wrote to Mara regularly, and she wrote back with stories of her new life, the students she was teaching, the curriculum she was developing, the other educators she was collaborating with. Her letters were full of energy and purpose, and reading them brought Ethan both joy and a bittersweet longing. Months became a year, then 2. Ethan's hair turned fully gray, and he noticed he moved a bit slower than he used to. The young man he'd hired to help with the ranch was practically running the operation now, with Ethan serving more as advisor than active worker. It was strange to acknowledge his own aging, to realize that he'd somehow become an elder statesman without quite noticing the transition. One late afternoon in early autumn, almost exactly 10 years after Mara had first appeared at his ranch, Ethan was mending harness leather on his porch when he saw a horse and rider approaching. Something about the rider's posture was familiar, and as they drew closer, his heart began to race. It was Mara. She'd changed in the 2 years since he'd last seen her in person. She was 23 now, fully an adult, with an air of authority and confidence that came from having found her place in the world. But when she dismounted and smiled at him, he saw in her face echoes of the frightened 13-year-old who'd once stood in this very spot and asked for help. "Hello, Ethan," she said simply. "Mara." He stood, his legs protesting the sudden movement. "What are you doing here? I thought the fall semester just started." "It did, but I asked for a few days' leave because I needed to see you, needed to tell you something in person rather than in a letter." Concern flooded through him. "Is something wrong? Are you in trouble?" No, nothing like that. She laughed, and the sound was pure joy. Actually, something's very right. The territorial legislature just passed new legislation, the Child Protection Act. It restricts the circumstances under which parents can contract their minor children into marriage, establishes a minimum age of 16 with judicial review required, and gives children the right to contest such arrangements before they're enforced. Ethan felt his breath catch. That's remarkable. It's partly because of us, because of the story we told, the case Judge Blackwood ruled on, the book that documented it all. Legislators cited it specifically during the debates. We changed the law, Ethan. We actually changed the law. He sat back down, suddenly overwhelmed. They'd changed the law. What had started as one man choosing to help one frightened girl had rippled outward until it touched the fundamental legal framework of the territory. Children throughout Montana would now have protections that hadn't existed before, rights that couldn't be signed away by parents treating them as property. Emma would have been proud, he said quietly. If she'd lived, she would have been so proud of what you've accomplished. I hope so. I like to think she's watching somehow, that she knows the good that came from her father's kindness. Mara sat beside him on the porch, in the same spot she'd occupied so many times over the years. But I also came to tell you something else. The normal school wants to expand to create satellite programs in rural communities. They want me to head the program, to travel throughout the territory training teachers in their own communities. That sounds perfect for you. It does. But there's a catch. I'd need to establish a headquarters somewhere central, somewhere I could operate from between my travels. She looked at him with hope shining in her eyes. I was thinking about the valley, about maybe building a small house near here, close to the people who first believed in me. Ethan felt warmth spread through his chest. You want to come home? If that's all right. I don't want to presume, but I thought, it's more than all right. It's perfect. They sat together as the sun descended toward the Bitterroot Range, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ethan thought about the journey they'd both taken, from that desperate night when a girl had shown up asking for help to this moment, when that same girl, now a woman of accomplishment and purpose, was choosing to return to the place where her new life had begun. Can I ask you something? Mara said softly. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Aunt Margaret had brought me to someone else's ranch? If some other person had been the one to make that choice? Sometimes, Ethan admitted, but I try not to dwell on it. All I know is that you came to me, and I made the only choice I could live with. Everything that followed came from that moment. You saved my life that night. You know that, right? Not just from Mr. Crow, but from giving up on myself. I was ready to accept that my life didn't matter, that I was just property to be traded. And you showed me something different. You showed yourself something different. I just provided the space for you to see it. They talked until full darkness fell, catching up on 2 years of letters that could never capture everything worth sharing. Mara told him about her students, about the teachers she'd trained, about the slow but steady progress she was seeing in attitudes toward children's rights. Ethan told her about the valley, about new families who'd joined the alliance, about Dutch Harrison's oldest daughter who'd just married and was expecting the valley's first fourth-generation child. As the evening grew late and the temperature dropped, Mara stood to leave for the Mueller's farm where she'd be staying during her visit. Before I go, she said, I want to thank you. Again and for always. You gave me my life back when I'd lost all hope. You stood between me and harm when it would have been easier to look away. And you taught me that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified. You taught me something too, Ethan replied. You taught me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that love can survive loss, that purpose can emerge from pain, and that sometimes saving someone else is how you save yourself. She hugged him tightly, and in that embrace, Ethan felt the completion of a circle that had begun 10 years earlier. The frightened child who'd sought his protection had become the confident woman who'd chosen to return, and in that transformation lay redemption for both of them. After Mara rode away into the darkness, Ethan remained on his porch, staring up at the stars scattered across the vast Montana sky. He thought about Emma, buried on the hill behind his house, and Sarah, resting beside her. He thought about the years of isolation and grief, of surviving rather than living. And he thought about a dust-covered wagon appearing at dusk, carrying a desperate woman and a frightened girl who would change everything. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of terror, of uncertainty, of wondering if the fight was worth the cost. But standing here now, knowing that Mara was free and flourishing, knowing that their struggle had helped change laws that would protect other children, knowing that his choice to stand for what was right had rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined. It had all been worth it. Every moment of risk, every day of uncertainty, every sacrifice made by everyone who'd stood with them. It had all been worth it. Because one brave decision really could change the course of a life forever. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, changing one life could help change the world. As Ethan finally headed inside, he paused at the door and looked back toward the horizon where Mara had disappeared. Somewhere out there in the darkness, she was riding toward her future. A future she'd earned through her own courage, supported by people who'd believed she deserved better than what the world had tried to give her. And that future was bright enough to light the way for others who would follow, children who would never know Mara's name, but who would benefit from the laws she'd helped inspire, the precedents she'd helped set, the stories she'd been brave enough to tell. It was a good legacy, Ethan thought, the kind of legacy worth fighting for, the kind worth everything they'd risked and everything they'd won. He went inside and closed the door on the cold autumn night, but the warmth of what they'd accomplished together, him and Mara and all the good people who'd stood with them, that warmth would stay with him for whatever years remained. And when his own time came, when he finally joined Emma and Sarah on that hill, he would go in peace. Because he'd done something that mattered. He'd stood for justice when it wasn't easy, protected the vulnerable when others looked away, and helped create a world just a little bit better than the one he'd found. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.